The raven arrived at Winterfell at dusk, a single dark silhouette against the burning sky, its wings cutting sharply through the cold air. Sansa Stark stood on the battlements, her cloak drawn tightly around her shoulders to guard against the bite of the North's chill. She watched the birds approach with curious eyes. In these dangerous times, every message had the power to shift loyalties, to bend destinies like branches in a fierce wind. While the sun dipped behind the snow-blanketed hills, she felt an unsettled stirring in the pit of her stomach, as if the old gods whispered warnings through the rustle of leafless weirwood branches. When the raven perched and offered its small scroll, she expected word from Daenerys or Jon, or perhaps news from the Vale. Instead, she felt a peculiar tension gather in the back of her neck as she unrolled the parchment and read a message that would upend all her careful calculations. "You and I share many enemies. We can bring them to their knees. Will you parley?" No signature, but the handwriting, precise and elegant, spoke of a regal hand with a taste for dominion. Sansa read it 3 times, pressing her lips together so none of her silent alarm escaped as a sound. She recognized the cunning tone, the sweet promise nestled within a single sentence. By the time she headed back toward her solar, she already suspected who had sent it. The only question was why. Cersei Lannister. Sansa lit a candle in the quiet of her chambers, the flame dancing across her expression of wary contemplation. One did not simply trust Cersei, nor did one lightly dismiss an overture from the woman who had outlived so many threats. In the days following the dawn of the new era, after the Great War had been won and the Night King shattered, Cersei had retreated to the Red Keep, poised behind her walls, always unyielding. Daenerys Targaryen had taken her measure, and Jon Snow had believed in an accord to unite the living against the dead. But now the dead were gone, and the living wrestled with the shape of a new world. Amid all that tumult, Sansa had grown tired of bending her knee to foreign queens, of trusting in the good intentions of men, of relying on fleeting alliances that could turn to ashes in her mouth. Even so, she found herself haunted by the idea that perhaps she wanted the same thing Cersei did: power. Stark truth warred with prudent caution in her mind. Memories of King's Landing darted like shadows across her consciousness. Joffrey's smile, Cersei's cold, watchful gaze. She remembered the humiliations, the terror, the nights spent trembling alone. But for all her cruelty, Cersei had always understood power's nature. She had shaped it around herself like a second skin. Now Sansa, older and tempered by loss, recognized the same thirst in her own heart. She would never be the girl she once was, praying for a storybook knight to rescue her. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned to navigate illusions and half-truths, who had learned from Peter Baelish that sometimes the greatest victories began with a precarious alliance. She neither tore the note nor dismissed it. Instead, she held it carefully above the candle flame, watching the edges curl as she memorized each letter. She extinguished the flame with a steady breath before the parchment fully ignited. With quiet resolve, she folded what was left of the message and locked it away. She would reply, cautiously, discreetly, but she would reply. That night, sleep came to her fitfully, as though the swirling conspiracies in her mind would not let her rest. Dawn arrived too soon, and with it a flurry of duties. She gathered a handful of trusted advisors into her solar, Brienne of Tarth, her faithful shield, Podrick Payne, discreet as ever, and a few stewards loyal to House Stark. She did not invite Arya, for she knew her sister would decry any alliance with Cersei outright and might, in her wrath, do something drastic. Instead, Sansa explained that an unnamed ally was seeking a meeting in the Riverlands, neutral ground. She needed to scout, to confirm possibilities, to test this prospective partner's trustworthiness. For the sake of appearances, she would take only a small retinue. "Who is this ally, my lady?" Brienne asked, standing tall, concern etched on her honest features. "Is it wise to meet them alone?" Sansa let out a measured breath. "I cannot say who it is," she replied. "Only that I trust my instincts, and I need you with me as a shield." She saw the flicker of acknowledgement pass over Brienne's face. That vow to guard Sansa's life with her own had never wavered. Wordlessly, preparations began. Horses were readied, and they left Winterfell under the pretext of visiting an ailing bannerman near Moat Cailin. The wind sliced across their faces, and the journey south felt like a passage into another world. One with fewer snows, with hills and rivers that gleamed in the pale sunlight of late winter. The Riverlands had once been ravaged by war, but it was regaining some measure of calm. Or so it seemed on the surface. On the fifth night of travel, near a ruined keep by the banks of a swollen river, Sansa and Brienne dismounted quietly. The cold pressed in around them, but the sense of watchful eyes pressed closer. Through the gloom, torchlight revealed a small camp. No Lannister banners were unfurled. Cersei remained cautious. She had come with only a handful of men in black leathers, no lion insignias. In the flickering torchlight, Sansa saw Cersei standing tall, clad in a dark gown lined with fur. No crown rested on her head now, only the presence that had made half the realm fear her. Beside her stood Qyburn, a silver fox of a man whose cunning gaze darted about the field. Ser Gregor was nowhere in sight. Perhaps Cersei thought the mountain too conspicuous a threat. Or perhaps she had simply hidden him in the shadows, ready to strike if negotiation turned sour. Brienne's knuckles whitened around the hilt of her sword. At a small gesture from Sansa, she relaxed, though her vigilance did not wane. Sansa turned her full attention to Cersei. The last time they had faced each other, Sansa had been a frightened girl, forced to play the submissive hostage. The memory stung like a fresh bruise, but Sansa forced her chin up. She was no longer that girl. Cersei's cool gaze swept over Sansa with a spark of recognition, as if she saw both the child she had tormented and the woman who had mastered her own brand of intrigue. "So," Cersei said, her voice like polished glass, "you came." Sansa inclined her head, though she did not kneel. "You offered me something worth coming for," she replied, words measured. "What is it that you truly want, Your Grace?" Cersei's lips curled into a thin smile. "Respect for my title. Interesting." She let the words hang. Then she exhaled, as though relenting. "I want what you want. An end to the power that Daenerys Targaryen wields over us both." It was a brazen statement, but it did not strike Sansa as surprising. She had half expected it. "I never said I wanted that," Sansa said carefully. "You didn't need to. You're not blind, girl. You see how the lords and small folk flock to her. They call her the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons. They celebrate Jon Snow, a man who spent his life gathering allies and goodwill, as if he could unite the entire realm under their dominion. Where does that leave us? In the north, you must bend the knee to a dragon queen who knows little of your people. And here, in the south, I see my father's legacy threatened by a foreign usurper. House Lannister won't bend, and neither will House Stark, not truly. Do not lie to me or to yourself." Sansa raised her chin. "You want to go to war against Daenerys," she said, voice just above a whisper. "What would that cost me if I agreed to join you?" Cersei took a moment, a small flicker of interest in her eyes. "All wars cost, Stark. But consider what happens if Daenerys cements her grip on the Iron Throne. Or if Jon Snow, your brother or your cousin or whatever he is to you, rules half the realm in her name, overshadowing the North's autonomy. You know as well as I that Targaryen fire consumes everything that stands in its way. Even if she does not mean to, she will subdue you. She will subdue your children, your lords, your traditions." Sansa's mind flickered with the memory of how Daenerys had arrived in the North, demanding fealty. She had come to fight the Night King, yes, but also to secure her claim. The North had looked to Sansa for leadership during Jon's absence. They still did, in many ways. "That is a fearful portrait you paint," she said softly. "Yet not an untrue one entirely. You're not a fool." "Neither am I," Cersei said, and for a moment, her voice dipped to a confessional hush. "Let us not play foolish games. I have resources and wealth. You have the loyalty of the North. Between us, we can broker new alliances that will erode Daenerys' base. The lords of the Reach still distrust her after her armies burned their fields. The Iron Islands are restless, though Yara Greyjoy has pledged herself to Daenerys. If we position our pieces carefully, the board will tilt in our favor." Sansa took in a small breath. She was not naive enough to believe Cersei was offering any genuine trust or friendship, but her arguments had teeth. She had studied the realm's shifting politics from her seat in Winterfell. The uneasy acceptance of a Targaryen queen with dragons had always been precarious. Perhaps, in the quiet hours of the night, Sansa had admitted to herself that Daenerys would eventually look upon the North as a rebellious vassal if they chafed under her rule. "What is your plan?" Sansa asked, quiet and direct. Cersei's lips parted in satisfaction, like a cat that has cornered a mouse but found the mouse to be unexpectedly cunning. "I propose a series of small, precise moves to undermine Daenerys' sense of security. First, we sow discontent among her southern lords. We isolate her from Jon Snow, or isolate Jon from his supporters. We let slip rumors that Jon plots to take the throne from her, that the North sees him as the true king. Mistrust will grow like a weed between them. Her counsel will fracture. And when the time is ripe, we strike swiftly, forcing her into a disadvantage, capturing her or crippling her armies before the dragons can respond." It was a vicious strategy, reminiscent of the man who had once manipulated Sansa, Littlefinger. But what disturbed Sansa most was the cold logic of it. "And how do you intend to handle the dragons themselves?" A flash of something like disappointment crossed Cersei's eyes. "They remain the greatest obstacle. But Qyburn assures me certain scorpions have been improved. We have ways. Dragons can be killed as one was above the Gold Road. We will ensure they are kept at bay long enough. If they do try to burn us out of the Red Keep, we'll have contingencies." Sansa's stomach churned at the prospect of more war, of bloodshed on a scale that might once again devastate the realm. Yet she could not deny that, in the aftermath of the Night King's defeat, there was already a sense of inevitability that another conflict loomed. Peace in Westeros had never lasted long. The banners had scarcely been folded when new rivalries began to stir. "You must know that Jon still holds the loyalty of the North," she said. "Even if they grow wary of Daenerys, they will not so readily turn on him. There are ways to separate him from his allies," Cersei said, her words laced with the casual cruelty Sansa remembered all too well. "Or from life, if necessary." Sansa could not let that pass unchecked. "If you mean to kill him, I will not be party to that. He is my blood." Cersei tilted her head. "You do not have to have his blood on your hands. But if you want power, true power, you must be prepared for difficult realities. Do not be squeamish now, Sansa Stark. Not after everything you have endured. If Jon will not stand aside, and if Daenerys refuses to relinquish her claims, then we must consider the finality of war." Brienne set her jaw, and Sansa could sense the night's outrage mounting. Sansa reached out gently, letting her hand graze Brienne's arm, a subtle request for restraint. There was no need to let this meeting spiral into violence. "Not yet. What I can promise is this," Cersei continued. "If you ally with me, the North will be recognized as an independent kingdom once Daenerys is dealt with. House Lannister will remain on the Iron Throne, and you will have your domain. I will not meddle in your governance. The North will be yours. That is more than Daenerys is likely to give you." Sansa had often fantasized about a truly independent North, one that would bow to no king or queen beyond the neck. It was an old dream, not just for her, but for many Northerners. Jon Snow's Targaryen heritage only complicated matters. Sansa breathed in the cold night air, letting the weight of her decision sink into her bones. "I will not kneel to you, nor will the North. If that's your bargain, then we can negotiate. But Jon's life remains off-limits." Cersei's lips pressed into a line. She did not overtly agree, but she did not protest. "Then let us consider a more delicate approach. Perhaps he can be isolated, convinced to leave Daenerys' side. Men have turned on their allies for less. If he does not see your machinations, perhaps he can be spared. I am not opposed to clemency when it serves my interests." The word clemency fell oddly from Cersei's tongue, and Sansa tried not to let her distaste show, but she reminded herself. She was here because she could not trust Daenerys wholeheartedly. Their clash of wills had been subdued only by the existential threat of the dead. With that threat gone, the old questions of sovereignty and loyalty rose again. And Sansa had no illusions that Daenerys, for all her talk of breaking wheels, was not above forging them anew in her own image. She and Cersei spoke further, each sounding out the other's willingness to compromise. The hush of the night enveloped them as the river's current whispered along the bank. Brienne stood silent, her face a tapestry of disapproval. Qyburn watched with sly interest, as though storing each of Sansa's expressions for later use. When at last the moon rose high, Sansa indicated she would consider the alliance and send word. Cersei agreed to wait 2 fortnights for a raven. After that, she said, her patience would wane. Sansa left with a heart heavy from the weight of what she was about to attempt. But there, in the flicker of the moonlight, she reminded herself that she was no longer a frightened bird in a golden cage. She was Lady of Winterfell, tempered by betrayals and sharpened by the cruel lessons of politics. If Cersei Lannister thought to use her merely as a pawn, she would learn that the North had new methods of outmaneuvering those who schemed against it. The ride back to Winterfell was quiet, punctuated by Brienne's occasional stolen glances, as if hoping Sansa would speak her mind. Finally, just past midday on the 3rd day of their return, Sansa reined in her horse, signaling a brief stop. Brienne dismounted, her expression tense. "My lady," she began, "this is madness. Cersei is cunning, deceitful. She will betray you the moment it suits her. You cannot truly be considering an alliance." Sansa climbed down from her horse, running a gloved hand over the beast's flank to calm it. "I have to consider everything. Our options grow thin, Brienne. The North stands on a knife's edge. Many of our people love Jon, but they do not trust Daenerys. She has dragons, she has armies from Essos. She has demanded their loyalty, and though we are grateful for her help against the Night King, gratitude does not last forever. Already, the lords grumble. Better to remain vigilant, to remain cautious," Brienne insisted. "But to align yourself with Cersei, she who had your father executed, who nearly destroyed your family, this cannot be the only course." Sansa's eyes glistened with a fleeting mixture of sorrow and resolve. "I know she's a monster in many ways, but the truth is, so is Daenerys if we threaten what she believes is hers. I do not trust either one of them to keep the North safe. If Jon stands beside Daenerys, how long until he places the North under her direct rule? He already abandoned his crown for her. Even if he believes it was necessary, our people see it differently." Brienne let out a slow sigh, pained. "I will follow you, Sansa, wherever you lead. But I beg you, do not let Cersei turn you into something you hate." Sansa nodded, a small sadness in her smile. "I won't. I am still Sansa Stark of Winterfell. No matter what I must do, I will do it for the good of our people." They resumed their journey, arriving at Winterfell to find the courtyard buzzing with activity. Arya was there, practicing her archery with a stoic determination. The moment she saw Sansa, she pulled the hood from her head and strode over, arrows still in hand. "You were gone longer than expected," Arya said, her tone challenging as she studied Sansa's face. "Is everything all right?" Sansa forced a relaxed expression. "Just delays on the road. No need for worry. How fares Winterfell?" Arya gave her a mildly suspicious glance but let the matter drop. "All is well," she said, "though rumor has it Jon and Daenerys will be visiting soon. They want to discuss the final arrangements for southern alliances and see to the North's readiness. You can guess how the lords feel about that." Sansa's pulse quickened. "When do they plan to arrive?" "Within the week," Arya said. "Davos sent a raven, politely asking if we can welcome them." Arya's mouth twisted slightly in annoyance. "We do as they ask, apparently." Sansa nodded, her mind already swirling with the new complication. If Jon and Daenerys arrived in a few days, Sansa would need to be prepared. She could not allow her facade to slip, nor could she let them suspect she was negotiating behind their backs. She held her sister's gaze. "Then we'll welcome them as our guests, as befits House Stark. Make sure the larders are full, the chambers ready." You know what to do. Arya studied her for a moment, as though picking up on Sansa's forced calm, but she merely nodded and walked off, her posture taut. Inside the solitude of her own chambers, Sansa penned a short note to Cersei, deliberately vague, yet indicating her willingness to explore a closer alliance. She omitted any mention of the contingencies regarding Jon. That part she would handle herself. She sealed the letter with the Stark sigil, though she prayed it would not reach the wrong hands, and handed it off to her most discreet courier, one she trusted beyond question. The man departed at nightfall, bound for the Riverlands with instructions to avoid notice. Days passed in a flurry of preparations. The weather relented enough for the roads to clear, and soon Sansa heard the sound of horns announcing the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow. She was in the Great Hall, flanked by lords sworn to House Stark. Dressed in a gown of gray and white, with the dire wolf at her breast, she presented herself as the Lady of Winterfell. Alongside her stood Arya, silent and watchful. The great doors swung open, and Daenerys entered, her silver-gold hair caught in braids, a thick cloak draped over her shoulders. By her side, Jon Snow walked with the familiarity of a man returning home, though his expression was subdued. Behind them came Tyrion Lannister, face shadowed by an inscrutable look, and Ser Davos, nodding greetings to the northern lords. Sansa inclined her head, neither a curtsy nor a bow. "Your Grace," she said, addressing Daenerys as queen, "we welcome you to Winterfell." Daenerys' violet eyes assessed the gathered northerners. A faint line of tension was visible at the corners of her mouth, as though she sensed the lingering resentment in the hall. She met Sansa's gaze with careful politeness. "Thank you for your hospitality, Lady Stark. Winterfell is as imposing as ever." Jon shifted his weight. He wore the thick furs of the north, but also the stark black attire that suggested his loyalty to Daenerys. "Sansa," he greeted more warmly, though there was a flicker of uncertainty behind his dark eyes. "It's good to see you. I hope the North is faring well in my absence." Sansa gave a thin smile. "We have managed. We always do." She sensed Daenerys' watchful presence, as though the queen was determined not to appear overshadowed. The tension between them was like a thin blade, invisible yet sharp. "Come, warm yourselves," Sansa offered, gesturing toward the fires roaring along the hall's walls. "We've prepared a feast to celebrate your safe arrival and to discuss matters of the realm." That evening, the great hall was lit with torches and candelabras, and the tables groaned under steaming platters of roasted meats, vegetables, and fresh bread. Wine from the arbor and ale from the local brewers flowed freely, loosening tongues, though not enough to dissolve the underlying caution among the northern lords. Many greeted Jon with genuine warmth, but eyed Daenerys with a rigid civility. Sansa took her seat near the high table, ensuring she was placed at equal footing with Daenerys and Jon. The conversation drifted to the realm's governance, the challenges of restoring the war-torn lands, and the forging of alliances. Tyrion offered measured commentary on the crown's finances, while Ser Davos spoke quietly with Lord Glover about shipping concerns. Arya observed everything from the periphery, silent as a shadow. Throughout the feast, Sansa and Daenerys exchanged a few polite remarks, never once raising their voices in anger. To an outside observer, it might have seemed a peaceful gathering, but Sansa felt the tension coil in her stomach. Daenerys occasionally glanced at her, as though suspecting Sansa's mind was drifting elsewhere. Sansa kept her features schooled, her heart carefully guarded. When the meal wound down, Jon rose. "My queen and I thank you all," he said, his voice carrying the faint lilt of his northern accent. "It's good to be among my own people again, though I come as an emissary for the realm. We have accomplished the impossible in defeating the Night King, but now we must ensure that the living prosper. Daenerys and I plan to travel through the north, hear the needs of the lords and small folk, and do what we can to restore stability. We welcome your counsel." Daenerys stood as well, her presence commanding despite her slight figure. "I know some of you have reservations," she said, "but I wish to remind you that I have fought for the living, that I came to your aid when no one else would. We are not enemies." If we work together, Westeros can flourish. Some of the lords murmured assent. Others remained silent. Sansa offered a diplomatic nod but kept her thoughts guarded. "It is late," she said, rising in turn. "We will all do well to get rest. Tomorrow we can discuss the next steps." The hall gradually emptied, and Sansa lingered a moment, exchanging a few words with the lords. Eventually, she made her way toward her private chambers. As she ascended the stone steps, she was not surprised to find Jon waiting near her door, leaning against the corridor wall. He straightened as she approached. "Sansa," he said softly, an almost tentative warmth in his expression. "We haven't had a chance to speak since I arrived." She nodded, ushering him inside so they could speak without prying ears. "It's been busy," she said, lighting a small lamp on the table. The flickering glow illuminated the tension etched in both their faces. Jon took a few steps closer, lowering his voice. "You seem distant. Are you truly so displeased that I've returned with Daenerys?" Sansa sighed. "Jon, it isn't about being displeased. It's about what the North needs. I know you believe Daenerys is our ally, that she will protect us, but I see the undercurrents. Her claim to the Iron Throne is contested. The Southern Lords whisper. The people here resent the idea of another Southern ruler, even if you stand beside her." Jon exhaled, a cloud of frustration darkening his features. "I never wanted a crown. I only wanted to protect our home. Daenerys fought for us against the dead. Doesn't that count for something?" "It does, of course it does," Sansa replied, gentler than she intended. "But people's hearts are not so easily swayed by gratitude. They fear dragons, Jon. They fear what her armies could do if we displease her. And they see you as a bridge to that power. They fear you might pull the North into wars that we never asked for. A war with Cersei is brewing, you know that." His jaw tightened. "Yes, and that war must be fought to unify the realm. We can't leave Cersei on the throne to plot against us. She refused to help us fight the dead. She betrayed us once. She'll do it again." Sansa fixed him with a steady gaze. "I know, yet the question remains. How much are we willing to sacrifice to dethrone her? How many Northern soldiers will die?" Jon's silence was heavy with conflict. "I hope it won't come to that. If we can make alliances strong enough, perhaps we can corner Cersei without a massive battle." Sansa sighed, forcing an expression of measured calm. "I truly hope so, Jon, for all our sakes." She touched his hand briefly, a sisterly gesture. "Get some rest. Winterfell is still your home, no matter what changes." He gave her a weary smile and left, closing the door behind him. Alone, Sansa stood in the gentle lamp glow, feeling the complexities of her position press down like a weight on her shoulders. She understood Jon's intentions. He was always guided by his sense of honor and duty. Yet in these times, honor alone might not be enough. And as she recalled her secret meeting with Cersei, she realized the path she was treading was rife with betrayal on all sides. Over the next few days, as Daenerys and Jon held talks with Northern lords, Sansa used her keen senses to gauge the mood. Lords Serwyn, Manderly, and other northern houses seemed outwardly supportive but wary. They wanted reassurance that Daenerys would not impose southern taxes or force them into further battles. Others, like Lord Glover, openly questioned the Queen's right to rule the North. Sansa played the role of the dutiful hostess, listening and advising, careful not to betray her deeper machinations. Tyrion Lannister, however, was a sharp observer. One afternoon, while Sansa was taking a quiet walk along the battlements, Tyrion appeared by her side, his breath pluming in the frosty air. She acknowledged him with a polite nod, conscious of the hidden tensions. "You're more guarded than usual, Lady Stark," Tyrion noted, leaning his elbows on the stone ledge, his gaze sweeping across Winterfell's courtyard. "The last time I saw you in King's Landing, you were calmer in your distrust." Sansa gave a small, rueful smile. "And I recall you advising me to trust Daenerys. Now I wonder if you still think the same." His features remained neutral. "I do, but I also know the North is a proud place, and you've never been one to accept others' claims blindly." Not after everything you've been through. So tell me, are you satisfied with the course of events? Or is something else happening behind that silent gaze? She could not openly reveal anything, especially not to a Lannister so close to Daenerys. Yet a part of her still respected Tyrion as one of the more decent members of his family. "I want what's best for my people," she said simply, "and I am considering how that might be achieved." He studied her face. "Well, I hope you consider that Daenerys does truly want to break the wheel. She believes in a realm free from tyranny. Whatever else, that is genuine in her." Sansa raised an eyebrow. "You'd never call her a tyrant, then?" Tyrion's hesitation was slight but telling. "She can be ruthless. She has to be to have come this far. But I don't believe she is a tyrant." They were quiet for a moment, the wind rustling the banners overhead. Sansa felt a pang of guilt at her secrecy, but she pushed it aside. "Thank you for your counsel, Lord Tyrion," she said, excusing herself. "Winterfell's corridors are colder than I remember. I must see to some business inside." He didn't stop her, but she sensed he was left with more questions than answers. She had to tread carefully. The following day, Sansa found a moment to pen another short letter to Cersei, relayed via her courier, instructing how to proceed. Cersei, in turn, assured Sansa she had quietly reached out to certain lords in the Reach and the Stormlands who bore grudges against Daenerys for the violence of her conquests. The seeds of discontent were being sown, while rumors circulated that Jon Snow might be the rightful heir, that Daenerys feared his claim. Sansa did not relish stoking those rumors, but she recognized their value in fracturing the unity of the Targaryen supporters. Late one evening, Daenerys requested a private audience with Sansa in the Godswood, a place of quiet reflection overshadowed by the heart tree's ancient face. Snow dusted the ground, and the air was bitter, but Daenerys arrived clad in thick white fur, her cheeks flushed by the cold. Sansa stood with her cloak drawn, back straight as she faced the queen. "I wanted a moment alone with you," Daenerys began, her tone gentler than Sansa expected. "Jon speaks so highly of you. He says you're one of the strongest people he's ever known, and I can see why. But you and I, we have not found common ground." Sansa's breath formed a faint cloud. "No, we haven't." Daenerys looked around at the sacred grove. "You and I should not be enemies. I want the Seven Kingdoms united, yes, but I do not want to subjugate the North against its will. If it were only that simple. The realm needs stability, or else more petty kings and queens will rise. I must secure the Iron Throne, if only to prevent endless wars from flaring up again." Sansa let her eyes trace the weirwood's crimson leaves, her voice hushed. "We never asked for a Targaryen to save us, Your Grace. We only asked for aid against the dead. We appreciate you answered that call, but the North has bled in too many wars. We want peace. We want to govern ourselves as we see fit." Daenerys' eyes tightened. "And if I granted you that autonomy, would you stand with me against those who would tear the realm apart? Against Cersei?" Sansa felt her heart give a small jolt. She met Daenerys' gaze. "I cannot speak for every northern lord, but I believe we would defend the realm if it were threatened. We simply do not want to be dragged into another war for the sake of someone else's crown." A flash of frustration crossed Daenerys' face, but she masked it. "I see. It seems we are fated to circle around each other in these arguments." She hesitated, something vulnerable entering her eyes. "Jon says he doesn't want the throne, that he only wants peace. But I can't ignore that others see him as a threat to my claim. I'm not blind to the realm's whispers." Sansa decided to take a slight risk. "Jon truly doesn't want it. But you're right, some lords will prefer him. It's the blood of Rhaegar Targaryen, after all, and he's proven his valor against the Night King. If you try to force him or the North to bend entirely, you risk making him into a rival." Daenerys stared at the snow-laden branches. "I suppose I shall have to trust his word, and hopefully yours. I don't relish another war, Sansa. I promise you that." The sadness in Daenerys' voice was almost convincing, but Sansa knew the Queen of Dragons would never relinquish her ambitions without a fight. "For the North's sake, I hope you find a peaceful solution," Sansa said. Daenerys's lips curved into a faint, tired smile. "So do I." She turned and walked away, leaving Sansa alone under the ancient tree. The hush of the gods would wait upon her, and for a moment she pressed her hand to the scarred trunk of the weirwood, feeling the bark's grooves beneath her palm. She wondered if the old gods found her actions justified, if they saw the web of deceit she was spinning to protect the North. She stood there for a long time, until the cold sank into her bones and forced her inside. Over the weeks that followed, Daenerys and Jon visited White Harbor, seeking to calm the local lords. Tyrion traveled to the Vale to secure a promise of neutrality from Lord Royce. All the while, Sansa continued exchanging ciphers with Cersei. She downplayed her direct involvement, carefully phrasing her letters to ensure plausible deniability if they were intercepted. Yet the plan advanced. Small pockets of rebellion flared in the Crownlands and the Reach, forcing Daenerys to dispatch unsullied garrisons. Whispers of discontent reached King's Landing, and soon enough, Daenerys grew uneasy. One night, word came that a large portion of the Golden Company, once hired by Cersei but believed disbanded, had reformed under new contracts, financed by mysterious benefactors in the Free Cities. It was rumored they might be sailing for Westeros again, loyal to Cersei's gold. Daenerys, furious, ordered her fleet to prepare. She planned to strike quickly, but Tyrion counseled caution, reminding her that a hasty assault could lead to ambush. The Queen's rage simmered, and Sansa observed from behind patient eyes, saying little, letting the tension build. Meanwhile, Jon, torn between loyalty to Daenerys and affection for his home, found himself caught in the crossfire. One evening, he confronted Sansa in her solar, shutting the door behind him with a quiet urgency. "Sansa," he said, stepping close, "I feel as though I'm losing control of events. The realm is on the brink of war again, and rumors swirl that some northern houses won't support Daenerys. I keep hearing your name in these rumors that you've been in contact with certain parties. Please, tell me it isn't true." Her heart hammered, but she kept her gaze steady. "You suspect me of conspiring against her?" He exhaled heavily. "I don't want to, but others do. Daenerys is wary, and Tyrion has noticed your reserve. If something is happening, I need to know. If you are working against her, Sansa, you're working against me." She felt a pang at that. "Jon, I only work for the good of the North. You cannot deny the Lord's discontent. They do not want to be dragged into another war." He pressed his lips together, anguish in his eyes. "I don't want that either. But what choice do we have if Cersei means to rally an army against us? If the realm falls apart, do you think the North will be spared? We must stand together." She frowned, taking a measured breath. "Standing together doesn't mean surrendering everything. Jon, if you align the North fully under Daenerys without securing our rights, we become no better than a conquered territory. You gave up your crown once. Many in the North believe that was too great a sacrifice, even if you meant well." His frustration flared. "I did what I had to do so we could survive. If not for Daenerys' armies and her dragons, we might all be whites now, shambling in the snow." Sansa nodded, voice trembling slightly. "And I am grateful. But the future matters too, Jon. We can't live forever in the shadow of what might have been. If Daenerys becomes queen of all 7 kingdoms, the North will never be truly free." Jon's eyes searched hers. "Is this truly what you want? Independence at any cost?" She set her jaw. "I want a secure North. If that means forging alliances with those who oppose Daenerys, I will consider it. But I have not broken faith with you, Jon. You are my family. I will never seek to harm you." He swallowed, sorrow playing across his features. "I wish I could believe that's enough." Before she could reply, he left, leaving her alone in the flickering shadows of the solar. A wave of guilt washed over her, yet she hardened herself. If Jon stood in the way of the North's freedom, she would have to circumvent him without outright hurting him. Cersei might demand more extreme measures, but Sansa hoped to avoid them. The best outcome would be to sow enough discord that Daenerys lost her southern power base, forcing her to negotiate terms for the North's independence. If that failed, Sansa tried not to dwell on the dire consequences. Weeks melted into a turbulent blur. Cersei's machinations grew bolder, and Daenerys' frustration mounted. Tensions between the queen and her hand, Tyrion, rose as well, for he counseled negotiation, not reckless engagement. But Daenerys wanted results. The unexpected news came one chilly morning. Euron Greyjoy had aligned with the remnants of the Golden Company, attacking Targaryen supply ships off the coast of the Stormlands. A savage naval confrontation left Daenerys' forces crippled at sea, forcing her to rely on overland routes. The blow rattled Daenerys' confidence. Rumors reached her that certain lords in the Reach were rallying behind a rumored alliance with House Lannister, hoping that if Daenerys was defeated, they might see a more pliable monarch or a newly proclaimed king in the north. All the while, the name Jon Targaryen was whispered in taverns and council halls. Sansa saw the strain in Daenerys' eyes whenever she looked at Jon, as though wondering if he would seize the throne or if he was unwittingly fueling the rebellion. Sansa watched as the queen's paranoia grew. Then, one cold twilight, Daenerys summoned Sansa to a private council in Winterfell's Great Hall. She stood there with Jon and Tyrion, the orange glow of torches casting wavering shadows. Arya stood to one side, arms folded, silent. Daenerys' expression was etched with grim resolve. "I've come to a decision," Daenerys announced, her voice carrying through the empty hall. "We cannot linger here in the north any longer, waiting for Cersei to pick off our allies. Jon and I will ride south with all the forces we can muster to confront her. Winter is receding, the roads are passable, and we must strike before she fortifies King's Landing further. The north will be called upon to send their banners." Sansa inclined her head, her insides twisting. "To engage in open war? If that is what it takes," Daenerys said, steel in her tone. She fixed Sansa with a piercing look. "Will the North honor its commitment, Lady Stark? Will they stand with their rightful monarch?" Sansa measured her words carefully, aware that Arya's intense gaze was upon her, as well as Jon's. "The North remembers its alliances," she said, which was non-committal at best. "But many of our banners are weary, resources depleted. We must guard our home. The North is vast, and pockets of wildling raiders remain. To send our full strength south," Jon cut in, frustration lacing his voice. "Sansa, we have no choice. If Cersei is allowed to regroup, she'll destroy us all. We need every able-bodied man and woman. Don't you see that?" She turned her gaze to him. "I see that the North has its own interests to protect, Jon." Daenerys' temper flared. "Would you have me believe you're refusing to send the troops we need? After all I've done to save your people from the Night King, you would deny me now?" A tense silence fell. Arya's expression darkened, scanning the faces in the hall. Sansa spoke slowly, in a tone that brooked no immediate retort. "Your Grace, I am simple. Why stating the reality of our situation? The lords might muster some of their forces, but not all. We cannot leave the north undefended." Daenerys clenched her jaw. Tyrion stepped in, raising a placating hand. "Perhaps a compromise, my queen. Some portion of the northern forces could march with us, while others remain to protect the north. And we can request additional support from the Vale or the Riverlands." "They are hardly reliable," Daenerys snapped, then closed her eyes, gathering herself. "Fine, we will do what we must, but I expect cooperation. If I sense any reluctance bordering on betrayal, I will not forget it." Sansa held the queen's gaze, letting the silent tension speak for itself. Jon looked between them, torn. Finally, Daenerys turned on her heel and strode from the hall, Tyrion following in her wake, brow knitted in concern. Arya and Sansa stood quietly, the torches crackling. "Is there something you want to tell me?" Arya asked, her voice quiet but pointed. Sansa forced a neutral expression. "I've told you everything necessary. We need to be prepared for all outcomes. If Daenerys insists on taking the North's full force, we risk leaving our home vulnerable. We must be cautious." Arya studied her with that relentless stare. "Cautious?" she repeated, as if the word carried hidden meaning. I hope that's all you're being." Before Sansa could answer, Arya left, her footsteps echoing down the corridor. That echo reverberated in Sansa's mind long after her sister had vanished from sight. Cersei's next raven arrived bearing a message of triumph. Euron had smashed Daenerys' fleet, and the Lannisters were prepared to face the Targaryens on land. Sansa read it with a mixture of dread and a dark flicker of satisfaction. The seeds were bearing fruit. It would force Daenerys into a hasty campaign, which might expose her to further defeats. But she also worried how many would perish in the fires of this war. She had hoped for a swift political resolution, yet the drums of conflict beat too loudly to be ignored. A council of Northern Lords was called in Winterfell's main hall. Jon and Daenerys presided, with Sansa seated to one side, bearing a calm yet watchful demeanor. The lords debated how many levies to send, how to maintain supply lines, and who would remain behind to defend the north. Daenerys grew impatient with the dithering, while Jon tried to smooth matters, his frustration mounting with each objection. Sansa added gentle but persistent reminders of the hardships the north faced. In the end, a compromise was reached. Half the northern forces would march south alongside Daenerys unsullied, her Dothraki, and the Vale Knights who had pledged to help. The other half would remain to guard Winterfell and the surrounding territories. By the time the meeting ended, Daenerys looked drained, and Jon was quiet with pent-up worry. Sansa watched them leave, relief warring with guilt in her breast. She knew Cersei's advantage was growing each day. On the eve of the departure, Daenerys' 2 dragons circled Winterfell's skies, a fearful reminder of her power. Sansa stood by a parapet, gazing up at the beasts. Even at this distance, the wash of their wings stirred the icy wind across her cheeks. She wondered how many scorpions Cersei had readied, how soon until those dragons might fall to the same fate as Rhaegal had on the Gold Road. Sansa shivered, uncertain if it was the cold or the moral weight that made her tremble. Jon found her there, wrapped in furs, hair catching the moonlight. He placed a hesitant hand on her shoulder. "Tomorrow we march. Will you see us off?" She nodded, not turning to face him. "Of course." He stepped closer, his presence warm in the chill air. "Sansa, no matter our differences, remember that you are my family. I love you. I hope you won't betray me or do anything that leads to more bloodshed." She closed her eyes, taking in a slow breath. "I love you too," she said softly. "I only want what's best for all of us." They stood in silence for a time, 2 figures on Winterfell's walls, each shaped by the bitter lessons of the past, each resigned to their own path. At dawn, Daenerys' host assembled in the courtyard. Unsullied ranks in perfect formation, Dothraki riders stamping their hooves impatiently, northern banners fluttering among them. The Vale Knights, stern and silent, waited with the practiced discipline of men who had seen war. Daenerys, mounted on a white horse, surveyed them, her braided hair gleaming with a faint frost. Jon rode beside her, ghost padding silently nearby. Tyrion and Ser Davos lingered close to the Queen, exchanging last-minute details about supply wagons and routes. Sansa stood on the steps of the Great Hall, Arya at her side. She watched as Jon spurred his horse forward to address the assembled men. He spoke of unity, of the need to protect their families by ending Cersei's threat. He tried to inspire them with the same fierce devotion he had once evoked against the dead. The lords and knights responded with cautious determination. Then, with a final salute, Jon and Daenerys led the column out of Winterfell's gates, the thunder of hooves and the clank of armor reverberating across the courtyard. Sansa felt Arya's sharp gaze on her. "Sister," Arya said, her tone loaded with questions. "We've faced many enemies. Are we sure we're not about to make more?" Sansa's expression was inscrutable. "We do what we must, Arya. We always have." She turned and walked away, heading to the solar where she would compose her next raven to Cersei. Outside, the day's sunlight glinted off the departing host, neither bright nor warm in the winter air. Unbeknownst to Daenerys or Jon, ravens bearing coded letters had already taken flight, carrying updates to the Queen in the south. The wheel was turning, And soon, a confrontation would ignite that might reshape Westeros yet again. In King's Landing, Cersei Lannister stepped out onto a balcony overlooking the city. She held Sansa's latest letter in her hand, eyes scanning the words. She smirked, a faint, lethal satisfaction curving her lips. The alliance was working. The realm was fracturing precisely as she wanted. Qyburn awaited her orders, and she gave them with an air of confidence that bordered on the triumphant. Soon, Daenerys Targaryen would march into carefully prepared traps, and the scorpions aimed at her dragons would be ready. Her gaze roamed across the sprawling city, from the Red Keep's walls to the impoverished warrens of Flea Bottom. She had sacrificed so much, endured the loss of her children, outlived foes who had once seemed untouchable. Now, at last, victory felt within reach. But she would not underestimate Daenerys or Jon. Instead, she counted on the seeds of doubt Sansa had helped her plant, the gossip that inflated Jon's claim, the resentment among the southern lords. In the labyrinth of power, illusions often won wars before swords were drawn. She turned sharply and strode back inside, handing the letter to Qyburn. "Burn it," she commanded. "Then ensure our forces are positioned according to plan. Rally the Golden Company at the Rose Road. We'll strike them before they can gather their full strength. The days of Targaryens presuming to rule are coming to an end." That night, in the secrecy of her chambers, Cersei let herself indulge in a soft chuckle. Who would have thought that the frightened Stark girl she once tormented at court would become so pivotal? But the game changed people, devoured the weak, and shaped the strong. Sansa Stark, it appeared, had learned the value of subtle betrayals. In the swirling complexities of alliances, Cersei saw a reflection of her own cunning. She would use the Stark girl's ambition as a lever, a wedge to topple the Targaryen. Far to the north, Sansa read the response Cersei had sent before the final departure. Like invisible ink, it spelled out a final plan. Lure Daenerys' main army south, isolate the dragons, and strike. The north would maintain plausible deniability, sending only half its forces. Once Daenerys was defeated, Cersei would affirm the North's sovereignty. Sansa's eyes lingered on the line. The life of the bastard can be spared if it serves our interests. She felt a flare of anger and closed her eyes. She had demanded Jon's safety. She prayed Cersei would honor that condition. But she had no illusions about Cersei's capacity for betrayal. Still, Sansa steeled her resolve. If Cersei reneged, Sansa would not be powerless. She had her own loyal bannermen, her own knowledge of King's Landing's weak points from her years at court, and she would have the Vale's knights, who still followed her cousin Robin Arryn, though guided more by Lord Royce and her own influence. There were many moves yet to be played, many threads that could unravel at any moment. No one, not even Sansa, could know how the final chapter would unfold. War was inevitable, blood would be spilled, but Sansa promised herself that, in the end, she would protect the North from another subjugation. Whether by forging alliances in secret or by letting her half-brother, her cousin, collide with the unstoppable will of the Lannister queen, she intended to reshape the realm's balance of power. Dawn broke over Winterfell with a pale, wintry light. Snow dusted the ramparts. Sansa stood on the walls again, gazing southward, her breath escaping in a quiet exhalation. She imagined the armies marching, the dragons soaring overhead, the clash of steel that would soon echo across the southern fields. She wondered if the songs of this new war would echo with the same sorrow as all the wars before it. She thought of Jon, riding at Daenerys' side, torn between love and duty. She thought of Arya, as sharp and inscrutable as Valyrian steel, trusting no queen but her sister. She thought of Tyrion, trying to keep the queen's wrath in check, mindful that each misstep could cost him his life. And she thought of Cersei, the cunning lioness who had used the darkest of methods to stay alive and in power. Now, Sansa herself was entangled in Cersei's web, weaving her own threads within it. A raven cried overhead, wings beating against the cold wind, as if mocking the quiet dread in Sansa's heart. She pressed her lips into a thin line, remembering the girl she once was, forced to kneel in King's Landing. That girl had long since vanished. In her place stood a new wolf, one that understood the savage nature of this game. Without ceremony, she turned and descended the steps, disappearing into the keep's shadowed corridors. Plans would need to be finalized. The North must be ready for any outcome. No more illusions of a simple future. Only the stark truth of power remained, and Sansa Stark intended to seize it, whatever the cost. Far away, in the rolling plains of the Reach, Daenerys' vanguard crossed farmland scorched from previous battles. Smoke from distant fires tainted the sky. Her face was set in grim determination, dragons flying overhead casting monstrous shadows on the ground below. Jon rode beside her, the weight of his ancestors pressing on him. The Dothraki outriders reported sightings of Lannister patrols. Tension crackled in the air, an unspoken anticipation of battle. They moved steadily south, seeking to outmaneuver Euron's forces, to find a place to confront the Golden Company on their own terms. Ser Davos conferred with Tyrion over maps of the region, trying to guess where the decisive clash might occur. Meanwhile, Daenerys stared out toward the horizon, her eyes harboring flickers of fear and anger. For all her talk of breaking the wheel turned still, grinding on. She had once imagined a swift conquest, welcomed by people longing for liberation. But the reality was far more tangled. Jon rode in silence, wrestling with the gnawing worry that something was amiss. He recalled the look in Sansa's eyes, the subtle tension in her posture whenever Daenerys' claims were mentioned. He feared, deep down, that Sansa was orchestrating something beyond his grasp, and that it might tear the realm apart. Yet it was too late to turn back. War beckoned, and he had pledged to stand at Daenerys' side. The wind whipped at Daenerys' hair, and Drogon roared overhead, urging them onward. Sunlight glinted off the unsullied spears. The northern banners fluttered grimly amid the columns of marching men. In King's Landing, the Lannister lions awaited with cunning and steel. In Winterfell, a solitary figure in gray and white studied secret letters by candlelight, forging a precarious partnership with the realm's most dangerous queen. This was the shape of Westeros now. Alliances built on shifting sands, each step forward a gamble, each decision a potential betrayal. Sansa watched from a distance, her soul torn between loyalty and ambition, yearning for a north that would never again bend its knee, yet unsure how many lives might be lost in the pursuit of that freedom. Cersei, perched on her throne of lies, gambled that Sansa's thirst for independence would lead Jon and Daenerys into her waiting jaws. Jon, an honorable man in a dishonorable world, gambled on a queen who burned with righteous fury. Daenerys gambled that her dragons and her destiny would save her from the cunning of lions and wolves alike. The drumbeats of conflict loomed, growing louder with each passing day. No one could see the final hour's shape. But when it came, it would be carved into history with blood and fire, with knives in the dark and thunder in the sky. And when the last echoes of battle died away, the question would remain: what new shape of power would emerge from the ashes? Would it be Cersei and Sansa, an unlikely alliance forging a new order? Or would Daenerys' dragons triumph one last time, searing the realm's illusions in cleansing flame? In the quiet of Winterfell's library, Sansa closed her eyes and breathed in the scent of old parchment. She could almost hear the snow falling outside. This was her moment of stillness before the storm. She had never felt so certain, yet so terrified. Her path had been set, her game in motion. And as with every Game of Thrones, the penalty for losing would be death or worse. But if she won, if Cersei kept her word, or if she found a way to force her compliance, the North would be free at last. So she sharpened her mind, recalling every lesson learned from the likes of Cersei, Littlefinger, Tyrion, even Ramsay. Each had taught her about the nature of power and the necessity of survival. She thought of her mother, Catelyn Stark, and how fiercely she had fought for her children. She thought of Ned Stark, whose unbending honor had cost him his life in King's Landing. Now, Sansa would thread the needle between cunning and honor, forging a future out of the realm's broken pieces. Outside, a raven cawed, and distant horns signaled the changing of the guard. Sansa slipped from the library into the corridor's flickering torchlight, her cloak trailing behind her. She would wait for word of the coming battle, for news of how Daenerys' forces fared against the Golden Company and Lannister cunning. She would wait, half in dread, half in hope. Because if the realm was to break again, perhaps this time, she could gather the fragments and shape them into something new. Something that would secure the North's independence and ensure that no Stark would ever again stand as a hostage or bend the knee to a foreign monarch. Beyond Winterfell's walls, the world tilted inexorably toward a clash of queens and kings, of dragons and lions, wolves and lions, swords and scorpions. The snows of winter lingered, but the seeds of war had taken root, blossoming into a tangle of blood and ambition. And through it all, Sansa Stark's name would resonate in hushed corridors and whispered confessions, a testament to the quiet, poised cunning of a woman forged by torment and tempered by hope. If the old gods watched from the weirwoods, their carved faces would betray no emotion. They had seen countless cycles of war and peace, had watched the rise and fall of dynasties. Now, they bore witness to the shifting alliances of mortals once more. As the last glimmers of daylight faded over Winterfell, they gazed upon Sansa Stark and Cersei Lannister, two women once bound by cruelty, now bound by a shared hunger for power and freedom. A new age stood on the brink of birth, and no one could say which queen would rise or which would be brought to ruin. But the North remembered, and soon so would the rest of Westeros. Dark clouds stretched across the early evening sky above Winterfell, staining the last pale streaks of dusk with a dire sense of foreboding. Ever since Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow had led their combined hosts south, an uneasy hush clung to the ancient castle like a funeral shroud. Sansa Stark wandered its battlements, her fur-lined cloak buffeted by the wind, each swirl of air seeming to echo the silent turmoil in her mind. War was brewing miles away, yet Winterfell felt no less haunted by it. Each morning brought new ravens, coded messages passing between Sansa and her unlikely ally, Cersei Lannister, quietly shaping the lines of conflict. Sansa never wrote her instructions in plain ink, relying instead on subtle ciphers taught to her by Peter Baelish, another ghost in her memory. She could almost hear Peter's voice whispering that chaos was a ladder, that alliances often shifted like quicksand. She thought of how she had outmaneuvered him in the end, turning his own manipulations against him. But she wondered, at times, if she had inherited a piece of his cunning along with his knowledge. Tonight, she made her slow circuit around the castle walls, glancing at the torches below that flickered like a chain of beacons. She paused at intervals, mindful of the sentries passing by with respectful nods. Sansa's presence steadied them in these anxious days, yet the lords who had remained behind were restless. The half of the northern forces that had gone south with Jon served mostly to maintain the illusion that Winterfell stood aligned behind the Targaryen queen. But Sansa knew that illusions could fail. She could sense the quiet suspicions in many eyes, especially Arya's. In the courtyard below, the clatter of steel rose into the frigid air. Men drilled with wooden practice swords, overseen by a master-at-arms who barked instructions. Sansa allowed herself a moment to watch. She thought of Jon's eagerness to train the royal recruits against the White Walkers not so long ago. That threat had disappeared in a single night of fire and blood. Yet here they all stood on the brink of another cataclysm. Mortal wars were seldom more merciful. Reaching the corner of the battlements, Sansa found herself face to face with Arya. Her sister had appeared with that uncanny silence that often unnerved people, though Sansa had grown used to it. Arya's hair was cropped at her shoulders, blowing across the leather and wool she wore. In her hands, she idly turned a dagger, the Valyrian steel catching glints of torchlight. "Sister," Arya said in a voice that was neither warm nor cold. "I was looking for you." Sansa inclined her head. "You found me." Arya leaned her elbows on the stone, gazing at the northern sky. Her breath plumed in short bursts. "It's quiet here," she said, as though the silence itself put her on edge. "Too quiet, perhaps." Arya slid the dagger into her belt. "I keep hearing rumors. The lords are uneasy. They sense that Daenerys could lose if Cersei's moves prove clever enough. They whisper about that possibility as though it might shield them from the cost of war." or as though they hope it happens. Sansa studied Arya's face in the flickering gloom, uncertain how forthright to be. The cost of war is always high. The Northern Lords have no desire to pay it. They fought the Night King, they lost many men. They fear a new conflict in the south. Arya pivoted, letting her gaze roam across Sansa. And where do you stand, truly? You're the Lady of Winterfell. The Lords look to you to guide them. Yet I sense you playing a deeper game than I can see. For a moment, Sansa considered lying outright. But Arya was no naive child. She had grown into an expert at reading people's body language, seeing the small flickers of truth behind falsehood. I am guiding them toward what's best for the North, Sansa answered softly. Isn't that our duty as Starks? Arya narrowed her eyes, remembering well how they had navigated similar questions during Littlefinger's final schemes. If that's all it is, then I'll not press further for now, she said, stepping back. But remember, Sansa, I'll know if you're crossing lines that can't be uncrossed. She turned and strode away, her steps making the barest tap on the stones. Sansa watched her vanish around the corner. She let out a slow breath, heart pounding. She hated that she could not share the fullness of her plan with Arya. She also knew her sister would never agree to collaborate with Cersei. Such an alliance would be anathema to the girl who had kept a list of names, the greatest of which had belonged to the Lannister queen. Yet Sansa told herself that the end justified the means. The North must be free. She left the walls and descended into the castle proper, the corridors lit by occasional rushlights. Behind the imposing doors of her solar, she found the warmth of a brazier and the hush of a private space. On the table, fresh parchment and ink awaited. The Stark sigil pressed into the wax seal beside them served as a constant reminder of her responsibilities. She resumed her seat, drawing her cloak tighter around her shoulders, then pulled a note from a small wooden chest. It bore Cersei's last message. Jon and Daenerys have moved. Their lines of supply are stretched. Euron has harried their ships. The Golden Company lies in wait. When the time is ripe, we crush the Targaryen. Ensure the North does not come to her rescue. Sansa stared at those words. She recalled once demanding from Cersei that Jon be spared. There had been no direct mention of that promise in this brief note. But Sansa clenched her jaw, determined to hold Cersei to it or find a way to ensure his safety if Cersei broke faith. After all, the Queen in King's Landing was as notorious for her betrayals as she was for her devotion to her children. This entire alliance was perched on a precarious ledge. With careful strokes, Sansa drafted her reply. For now, our arrangement stands. The North will keep most of our remaining reserves in Winterfell. The forces with Jon and Daenerys are minimal, half-hearted at best. I will see to it that they lack further reinforcements. You, in turn, will remember your promise regarding Jon Snow. If he is captured or forced to yield, you will show clemency. She ended it there, suspecting that the fewer words she used, the better. Then she sprinkled fine sand over the ink to dry it, tapping her nails lightly on the tabletop. Outside, the wind moaned around the towers, the sound mournful and ancient. A single candle flickered at her elbow, illuminating her face. She could almost imagine the old gods watching from behind the walls, their silent judgment a chill creeping along the base of her spine. But Sansa had come too far to recoil from difficult choices. She folded the parchment, sealed it with wax, and pressed the direwolf sigil firmly. Then she tucked it into a small leather pouch to be handed to her most discreet courier. When she stepped back out into the hallway, she nearly collided with Brienne of Tarth. The tall knight had been approaching, and she stopped short to avoid knocking Sansa over. Her expression, honest and forthright as ever, melted from surprise to concern. "My lady," Brienne said, bowing her head, "you're up late." "As are you, it seems," Sansa replied, forcing a faint smile. "Everything is in order?" Brienne nodded. "Yes, though some of the northern lords remain uneasy. They gather in small groups talking about the war in the south. They wonder if Daenerys and Jon can truly win." Sansa sighed softly. "Or if they should be supported at all." Brienne hesitated. "My lady, I know you are far more adept at these matters than I am, But I must ask, are we turning our backs on Jon? Sansa considered her words carefully. No, I would never turn my back on him. But I cannot fling open the gates and rush our men south when it may do more harm than good. The North has sacrificed enough. Jon made his choices. I only pray they do not lead to ruin. She could see a subtle flicker in Brienne's gaze, perhaps a doubt or a question unsaid. Then Brienne bowed again. I stand in your service, my lady. I swore an oath to protect you. If there's anything you need, anything, please let me know. Sansa touched Brienne's gauntlet hand gently. Thank you. I value your loyalty more than you know. They parted ways, each step echoing in the corridor's hush. Once alone, Sansa made for the small courtyard where a stable boy waited with a raven crate. She slipped the leather pouch into the raven's carrying tube, giving the stable boy precise instructions to ride to a remote holdfast, where a sworn retainer loyal to her alone would ferry the raven south. The boy was no more than 14, wide-eyed but eager to please. He nodded solemnly and soon disappeared, leading a sure-footed mount. Sansa watched him go, her chest tight. Another letter, another string pulled in this vast tapestry of war. Far to the south, dawn crept across barren fields marred by the scars of previous battles. Daenerys Targaryen rode at the head of her column, her horse snorting in the cold. Behind her, the Unsullied marched in unison, disciplined boots raising dust from the ground. The Dothraki rode in looser formation, an undercurrent of wild energy always about them. Jon Snow kept pace beside her, Ghost trotting behind, occasionally casting a wary red-eyed glance around. The warm season had begun to reassert itself, but winter's memory lingered in a crisp chill that bit through the air. Smoke rose from distant farmsteads, hints of conflict or hurried preparations. The Riverlands were not yet a battlefield, but they might soon become one. Rumors indicated that the Golden Company, bolstered by remnants of loyalist Lannister forces, had begun fortifying positions near the Rose Road and along the Blackwater. Euron Greyjoy's longships were said to hold some advantage at sea. With much of Daenerys' own fleet harried or sunk, transporting supplies by water was no longer as easy. Jon frowned at the horizon. We'll need to secure a stable base of operations, he said, voice tight with concern. We can't march on King's Landing with our supply lines already threatened. Tyrion Lannister, riding with more skill than he once had, came up alongside them. He wore a thick cloak over chainmail, the hand of the queen pin gleaming on his chest. We could attempt to hold Harrenhal, Tyrion suggested. It's large enough to host a portion of our army, but Harrenhal has its own ghosts and a lengthy supply route if we linger. Daenerys shook her head slightly. Harrenhal reeks of curses and ill fortune. We don't have time for siege warfare or for scouring out its rumored pockets of bandits. We must find a swifter route south, one that will let us confront Cersei on more favorable ground. Ser Davos, who had been listening intently, steered his horse nearer. Perhaps we can rest a few days at the crossroads inn, gather intelligence from the Riverlanders. Lady Bracken and Lady Smallwood might be persuaded to lend their local knowledge, if not direct troops. Jon nodded. I've met some of them before. They're pragmatic, but they might be willing to help if we can convince them that a Targaryen victory is inevitable. Daenerys let out a breath. We need allies. The more, the better, before Euron or the Golden Company can ambush us. Let's make for the crossroads inn then. We can resupply and see who is still loyal or neutral enough to sway. They pressed on, the sun climbing steadily. Dragons soared overhead, Drogon and Rhaegal's huge silhouettes drifting across the clouds. The wind from their wings stirred the men on the ground, evoking both awe and a whisper of fear. The presence of dragons had once shattered entire armies, but after Cersei's demonstration of scorpion bolts, and the shocking death of Viserion above the Gold Road, everyone knew these beasts were not invulnerable. Jon's gaze flicked up at Rhaegal, the dragon he had once ridden, feeling the familiar pang of wonder. But that wonder was now tinged with apprehension. Every day, he felt the tension rising between Daenerys and himself. The realm's whispers that he was the true heir refused to die, no matter how often he denied any ambition. Daenerys remained polite, yet he sensed her guardedness, her fear that the realm might prefer him. Despite her words that she trusted him, Jon knew the seeds of doubt had been planted. They might bloom at any moment. His thoughts drifted unbidden to Sansa, to Winterfell. He wished she could have written more supportive letters instead of the terse, formal words she had last sent. She had withheld a sizable portion of the northern forces, citing the need to defend the region. On one level, Jon understood, but the prospect of facing Cersei with fewer troops weighed heavily on his mind. He found himself caught in a lonely place, believing in Daenerys' cause, yet uneasy that the North might never forgive him if the war turned disastrous. They reached the crossroads, and shortly after midday, the Ancient in that had once borne witness to countless travelers, kings, and would-be conquerors. A battered sign still hung out front, creaking in the breeze. The yard could accommodate a few dozen horses, though the combined host would need to camp beyond the hill. Daenerys dismounted first, soldiers fanning out to secure the perimeter. Tyrion and Davos swiftly sought out the innkeeper, paying for exclusive use of the place. Inside, the common room was dim and smelled of stew and ale. Long tables took up much of the space, many of them empty save for a few local patrons who stood nervously at the sight of so many armed warriors. Jon could see tension etched in their faces. The last time armies had passed through, the Riverlands had been ravaged. An older woman with a kindly face, who introduced herself as Jaina, managed the inn. She curtsied repeatedly for Daenerys, her hands trembling. "My queen," Jaina said. "We didn't expect such grand company, but we'll do our best to meet your needs." Daenerys nodded with the faintest smile. "I thank you, Mistress Jaina. Have your stable boys water the horses. We'll pay for food and lodging." Then the queen's gaze took in the meager crowd. "We need fresh news of the surrounding lands. Has there been any sign of Lannister or Sellsword forces moving north?" Jaina's eyes flickered toward the corner of the room, where two travelers sat in cloaks that looked dusty from the road. "These men arrived last night, my queen. They said they saw outriders wearing the Golden Company's sigil. Elephants, I believe, though I haven't seen an elephant myself, not once in my life." Tyrion exchanged a glance with Daenerys. "So they've come this far north already. The Golden Company is usually posted around the Crownlands or the Stormlands. This suggests they're preparing a screen to slow our advance." Davos stroked his beard. "We might have to fight our way through if they're making a forward push. Let's confirm these rumors with the men." At a gesture from Daenerys, a pair of Unsullied approached the travelers in the corner, inviting them to speak. The two men looked reluctant but eventually approached the queen. They introduced themselves as merchants carrying cloth from the Vale. Though they claimed neutrality, fear colored their words. "We saw maybe 200 of them headed north by a small road." One of the merchants stammered. "We recognized the golden banners. Seemed they were scouting, maybe looking for weaknesses in the land. They asked us questions," the other merchant added, "about the Targaryen queen and the Stark in the north, but we played ignorant. Couldn't be sure if they'd kill us for a wrong answer." Daenerys listened intently, her jaw tight. She thanked them and had Jaina provide them food for their trouble. Then she turned to her advisors. "A skirmish might be inevitable. If the Golden Company is forming a net around us, we must break through or outmaneuver them. We have dragons. This won't be a simple matter for them." Tyrion's mouth pulled into a thin line. "True, but Qyburn has improved the scorpions, and the Golden Company might have some already. If they hide them along narrow roads or in passes, we risk an ambush. The dragons won't be safe unless we know where the bolts can come from." Jon watched Daenerys' expression as Tyrion spoke. Her face hardened, and he sensed the frustration she tried to hide. Though she had grown more tactical over time, losing one dragon to the Night King and another to Euron scorpions had left her with a blend of fury and caution. "We'll proceed carefully," she said. "If the Golden Company moves in small groups, we can engage them on our terms. Drogon and Rhaegal will remain high until the last moment, striking from above. We cannot give them an easy shot." She paused, looking around the common room. The flickering fire cast a golden wash on the stone walls, making the shadows dance. "We'll rest here tonight," she decided. "I want the men fed and given what comfort they can find. In the morning we march southwest, angled to avoid their net. If they attempt to chase us, we'll have the advantage." Jon inclined his head. "I'll check on our troops, ensure everyone's prepared." He paused, voice quieter as he addressed Daenerys alone. "We'll get through this. Once we reach King's Landing." Her violet eyes locked on him. "Then we bring Cersei to heel. Once and for all." She glanced at Tyrion. "I hope your sister is prepared to face what comes." Tyrion offered a wry grimace. "She always is. That's what worries me." Jon gave Daenerys a brief squeeze on the shoulder, then strode outside, mind churning with thoughts of the oncoming conflict. He had seen war enough times, but the notion of fighting a cunning foe armed with scorpions designed to kill dragons made his heart pound with anxiety. Even the Dothraki seemed subdued at the thought of facing such adversaries again. Outside, the combined camp had begun to sprawl across nearby fields, tents rising as far as the eye could see. Fires lit up the twilight, as men prepared what meager rations they had. The clang of blacksmith hammers drifted in from the far side, where equipment was being repaired. He found Grey Worm conferring with several unsullied officers near the main line of tents. The commander inclined his head in greeting. "Jon Snow," Grey Worm said simply. "How do your men fare?" Jon asked. "They fare well. Unsullied do not complain." Grey Worm's gaze slid past Jon, focusing on the fires. "But they are cautious. The last time we faced scorpions, many died, and the queen lost a dragon. The men remember." Jon sighed. "We'll be careful. Promise. Neither Daenerys nor I want to throw away lives. Be ready to move at first light. We'll be tested soon." Grey Worm nodded, jaw set, and resumed his preparations. As Jon turned, he noticed Gendry forging nails at a makeshift smithy. The young black-haired man hammered with strong, sure strokes, sweat glistening on his brow despite the evening chill. Jon approached, and Gendry paused to wipe his forehead. "Jon," he greeted, using the familiarity that stemmed from their service in the war against the dead. "How goes the smithing?" Gendry shrugged. "We repair what we can: armor, swords, arrowheads. We can't do much about the scorpions we might face, but if we survive to get close enough, I'll see to it that our men have the sharper blades." Jon pressed a hand to Gendry's shoulder. "Good. We'll need every edge we can get. How are you holding up otherwise?" "I'm no stranger to war," Gendry said, though the lines on his face indicated weariness. "But the men are nervous. Whispers say half the north stayed behind. Some wonder if we're heading into a slaughter without enough support." Jon's heart sank at the truth of it. "I can't force them to come," he murmured, "and I won't blame them for wanting to keep Winterfell defended. But we must do what we can with the force we have." Gendry nodded and returned to his work, hammer ringing out against metal. Jon walked away, a heaviness in his steps. This war felt more precarious than any he'd faced. The foe was cunning, well-funded, and apparently prepared. The alliances that had once rallied to Daenerys seemed uncertain. Even the North's half-hearted involvement weighed on him like a lead cloak. He forced himself to keep going, to check on the camp's perimeter, all the while fighting a sense of dread he couldn't quite banish. In the Red Keep's highest tower, the bells of King's Landing told the hour. Cersei Lannister stood on a balcony, gazing at the city that sprawled below. The hush of night wrapped around the streets, though pockets of torchlight dotted the darkness. Her golden hair fell in waves to her shoulders, a crown of subtle design resting atop her head. With a faint smile, she sipped from a goblet of wine, savoring its full-bodied richness. Qyburn waited discreetly a few steps behind her, hands folded, eyes roving the queen's expression for any sign of her mood. On a small table to her left rested a parchment, sealed with wax bearing the direwolf sigil, Sansa Stark's latest letter. Cersei had read it twice, and it amused her in a cold, clinical way to see how carefully the young wolf tried to phrase her demands. "Jon Snow's life is to be spared," We do not risk more than half our forces. The North stands in self-defense. When the Targaryen is defeated, the North is independent. Such naive hope, Cersei thought, swirling her wine. She had already mobilized the Golden Company, positioning them strategically near the Rose Road, along with her loyal Lannister troops. Euron Greyjoy's fleet prowled the waters, picking off any straggling ships that might bring supplies to Daenerys. The Scorpion bolts, carefully improved by Qyburn, were placed in key choke points. Elephants had not made it across the sea. Cersei still lamented the Golden Company's refusal to ship them, but thousands of mercenaries would suffice. She recalled the note's final lines, in which Sansa pressed for confirmation regarding Jon Snow's safety. Cersei tapped a fingernail against her goblet. Promises. The realm revolved around them as though they were currency, but she knew promises were only as strong as the advantage they offered. And if it became advantageous to kill Jon Snow, she would. Sansa Stark's heartbreak would be a minor cost, but for now, it suited Cersei to let Sansa believe otherwise. "Your Grace," Qyburn ventured softly, "shall I send a reply to Winterfell? Or perhaps we remain silent, to keep them uncertain." Cersei set her goblet down and turned, her face composed in regal calm. "I'll craft a reply," she said. "Sansa Stark grows bold, but she's still young in the ways of real power. She needs reassurance that we remain aligned. Let her cling to the notion that she can control me." A low chuckle escaped her lips. "Poor girl, to learn so late how illusions can crumble." Qyburn inclined his head. "As you wish, Your Grace." Cersei rested one hand on the table's edge, staring down at a map of Westeros. Little figurines indicated the known positions of her foes and allies. She traced a finger from the Riverlands toward King's Landing, then tapped near the Crownlands. "Have the Golden Company hold their positions, but I want scouts further north, pressuring Targaryen's host. If we can whittle down her forces or cripple her supply lines, she'll grow desperate. Perhaps she'll attempt a direct assault, and that's when the Scorpions and the wildfire caches will do their work." She thought of the caches hidden beneath certain roads, placed there at her command, an echo of her late father's cautionary strategies, or perhaps an echo of the Mad King's intentions. She never considered the moral weight of unleashing them on the city she ruled. Fear was her greatest weapon, and she would use it. "And if Targaryen tries to besiege King's Landing," Cersei continued, "we'll starve her army out while Euron's fleet blocks the seas. Let them watch the city walls until the men desert her. We'll see how quickly her so-called allies turn cloak." A twisted smile curved her lips as she imagined Daenerys' face contorted by defeat. She pictured Tyrion too, her traitorous brother, forced to witness the destruction of all he'd built with the foreign queen. As for Jon Snow, Cersei considered him a nuisance, a tool for Sansa if he survived. But she knew all too well that men with claims to the throne rarely accepted subservience for long. Should Sansa be naive enough to let him live, she would discover the pitfalls of that choice. Qyburn's voice broke her reverie. "Word has come that Lord Tarly's remaining bannermen may side with us if Daenerys' fortunes decline further. They still harbor bitterness over what she did to Randall Tarly and his son." Cersei raised an eyebrow. "Good. Let them see the Lannisters as the safer bet. We'll encourage them in that delusion, should it prove helpful." She made a final swirl of her wine, finishing it in one measured gulp. "Prepare parchment and ink, Qyburn. I'll dictate a reply to Lady Stark. Then ensure the Golden Company receives orders to harass Targaryen's flanks. If Daenerys insists on marching deeper into the Crownlands, she won't do so unscathed. In the end, we shall see which queen stands victorious." Qyburn bowed and drifted away, leaving Cersei alone with her map. The hush of the chamber seemed to resonate with unspoken threats. She felt the old thrill of triumph rise in her chest. Her father had always believed in subjugation through cunning and might. She, Cersei, had outlived him and many others, forging a new legacy in the ashes of those who underestimated her. Let the dragons come, she thought. Let them roar. She would find a way to silence them all. Night settled over the Crossroads Inn, the stars pricking the vast sky like silver nails. "Daenerys," restless from the day's tension, stepped outside the common room for a breath of fresh air. Flames crackled in the distant camp, men's voices carrying in low conversations. She spotted Jon near a small cluster of tents, conferring with Ser Davos and a handful of northern riders. The chilly breeze rustled her pale hair, reminding her that winter was only just beginning to retreat from these lands. She walked toward Jon, her footsteps quiet in the dewy grass. He caught sight of her and paused, nodding for the men to continue without him. Daenerys watched them disperse, then turned her gaze fully on Jon. She could see the flicker of torchlight reflecting in his dark eyes, an echo of 1,000 worries. "How are our men?" she asked softly. "Tired, but determined," Jon replied. "Most of them would follow you through the gates of King's Landing if you asked, but they're frightened too. The Golden Company and Euron's fleet, they're not trifling foes." Daenerys folded her arms. "I don't mean to dismiss their fears, but we've come too far to stop now. If we allow Cersei to rebuild her power, the realm will never know peace." Jon nodded, glancing over her shoulder to ensure no one was in earshot. "Daenerys, there's something I've wanted to say. I know you sense the rumors about me, about my claim. I want to remind you that I have no intention of pressing it. I meant what I said. I don't want the Iron Throne." Her eyes flashed with something close to gratitude mixed with a lingering doubt. "I believe you, Jon. It's not your ambition that worries me. It's the ambitions of others. People latch onto a symbol of power, and the truth becomes secondary. Even Sansa." She trailed off, uncertain how to voice her suspicion that Sansa had her own designs. "Your sister is cunning," Daenerys murmured. "I know she resents me." He frowned. "She wants the North to be free, not subjugated. She doesn't resent you for helping us defeat the Night King. She resents the idea that you might overshadow the North's autonomy." Daenerys arched an eyebrow. "Is that so different from resenting me? In any case, she can resent me all she wants, so long as she doesn't actively oppose me." Jon lowered his voice. "She wouldn't. She's loyal to me in her own way. I trust her to protect the North while we're gone. That's all." Daenerys sighed, letting her arms drop to her sides. "Then I hope your trust is not misplaced. We need to appear united, or else we give Cersei every advantage." Jon nodded. "Agreed. In the morning, we'll march for the southwestern roads. We can try to slip past the Golden Company's scouts, but if they confront us, we'll have to fight." Daenerys placed a hand lightly on his forearm, feeling the tension beneath his cloak. "Then let us pray to whatever gods might listen that we are up to the task." He put his own hand over hers, a rare display of closeness they rarely indulged in public. "We will be," he said, trying to sound confident. "We have dragons. We have the Dothraki, the Unsullied, and we have something Cersei lacks, a real bond with our forces. We're not paying sales words. We're inspiring followers." Daenerys managed a small smile at that. For a moment, she let herself feel hope. Then the wind gusted, bearing the distant smell of cooking fires and the faint tang of steel. The night pressed in, a reminder that dawn would bring new trials. North of the crossroads, a small squad of Golden Company scouts picked their way through a wooded area near a stream. They wore cloaks of muted hues, the golden sigils hidden beneath cloth to avoid detection. Their horses, bred for endurance, stepped carefully over gnarled roots and fallen branches. Lantern light bobbed in the dark as they mapped the terrain and listened for news of Daenerys' whereabouts. Their commander, a lean man named Colin Waters, bastard of a minor lord, rode at the front. He paused when they reached a break in the trees, the moonlight revealing a shallow ford across the stream. "Spread out," he whispered to his men. "Check for footprints or signs of passage." They obeyed, dismounting quietly. The rustle of leaves and trickling water underscored their caution. One man spotted a few hoof prints in the mud, not fresh but not ancient. Another found a discarded cloth that might have belonged to a Targaryen outrider. Colin knelt, running his fingers through the mud. "They've been through here," he said, keeping his voice low. "We'll head south, see if we can catch up to them or at least figure out their route. If we confirm their numbers, Cersei will pay handsomely for our report." One scout hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "And if the dragons find us?" Colin snorted softly. "Then we ride or die. The Golden Company didn't come here to cower in the bushes. Now move." They remounted, heading south under the cover of the dense forest. Their route would eventually converge with the main roads Daenerys might use. If fortune favored them, they could ambush a small group of outriders and glean more information. The Paymasters had made it clear. King's Landing wanted every scrap of intelligence about the Targaryen forces, especially about the dragons. In the hush of the woods, an owl hooted, and the riders pressed on, all too aware that dawn was a few hours away. They were men of fortune, loyal so long as the gold flowed. The Golden Company had a proud reputation, a code of conduct that demanded no desertion, and many of these men felt emboldened by it. Others, however, remembered the stories of Drogon's wrath on the battlefields near Highgarden. They knew all too well that gold and pride did little to protect flesh from dragonfire. At Winterfell, Sansa spent many hours in the library poring over maps of the southern roads, cross-referencing them with the knowledge she'd gleaned during her time in King's Landing. She traced routes along the Rose Road, the Gold Road, the King's Road that led all the way from the capital to the north. She studied the farmland, the small towns, and the fortress lines that might be used as choke points. Occasionally, she cross-checked details with Maester's accounts of historical battles. The pages rustled softly, the only sound in the otherwise quiet hall. She had chosen a corner far from the main reading tables, a single candle lighting her workspace. The library's high windows admitted thin moonlight, illuminating the rows of books and scrolls that collected centuries of knowledge. Sansa remembered coming here as a girl, reading tales of brave knights and noble queens. Now, she was forging a reality far more tangled and grim than any romance in those old stories. A discreet tap on the wooden doorframe startled her. She glanced up to see Lord Glover standing there, a cautious look on his face. He was a stout, bearded man, typical of the North, with keen eyes that hinted at an intelligence he rarely displayed in large gatherings. "Lord Glover," Sansa greeted softly, setting aside her quill. "What brings you here at this hour?" He stepped in, closing the distance with measured steps. "My lady, I have concerns about the shipments of grain we've been sending south. The men left behind to guard Winterfell are worried that if we continue to send stores away, we'll be left vulnerable when the snows return in earnest." Sansa folded her hands. "I understand, and indeed we must not impoverish ourselves. The arrangement was made in good faith for the half of our forces that traveled with Jon. They need supplies, but I will not jeopardize the welfare of the North. Reduce the shipments by half for now, citing poor harvest returns if questioned." Lord Glover nodded, relief evident. "Thank you, my lady. I'll relay the orders." He paused, then pressed on. "We also hear rumors that the Vale might be sending men to assist you here in Winterfell soon. Is that true?" Sansa arched an eyebrow. "Word travels quickly. I have requested additional defenses from the Vale, yes. Lord Robin Arryn is still untested, but he listens to Lord Royce, and Lord Royce respects my counsel." "And are we expecting an attack here in the north?" Glover asked, rubbing his bearded chin. "Surely Cersei wouldn't send an army this far." Sansa shook her head. "Not unless Daenerys is defeated and she decides to subjugate the entire realm. But caution costs little. House Glover will stand by us." He met her gaze firmly. "We will, as we always have." She smiled. "Good. Then trust me to keep the North safe. That is all." Lord Glover bowed, then turned to leave. Just as he reached the threshold, Sansa spoke again. "My lord, if you hear any of the men voicing discontent, come to me. I will address their fears directly. We cannot afford division within our walls." He inclined his head in understanding and departed. Once more alone, Sansa resumed her scrutiny of the maps. Her conversation with Lord Glover only reinforced the precarious balancing act she performed. On one hand, continuing the charade that the North supported Jon's campaign. On the other, preserving enough resources and men to maintain the North's strength if Daenerys lost, or if Sansa needed to enforce independence once Daenerys was weakened. She touched the corner of one map, her eyes lingering on King's Landing. She knew that place intimately. She remembered the Red Keep's corridors, the vantage from Maegor's Holdfast, the sour stench of Flea Bottom. She remembered the great September that was now rubble, thanks to Cersei's wildfire. In her nightmares, she saw Joffrey's sadistic grin, heard the crowds roar at Ned Stark's execution. King's Landing was a nest of horrors. Yet soon, Daenerys and Jon would be outside its walls, possibly hurling themselves against scorpions and well-trained sellswords. Sansa's thoughts circled to Cersei again, that ruthless creature who had once held her prisoner. Now, in a grand twist of fate, they corresponded as co-conspirators. Sansa recalled the cruelty in Cersei's smile, her willingness to commit any atrocity to safeguard her power. It was naive to believe that the promise to spare Jon would truly bind Cersei unless Sansa had a final piece to play. So, Sansa ruminated on what such a piece might be. Could she blackmail Cersei, threaten to reveal something that would undermine her hold on the throne? Could she forge an alliance with some southern houses that hated the Lannisters? One idea persisted. If Daenerys and Jon battered each other and Cersei ended up triumphant, the North could still muster fresh forces to reject the Iron Throne's claims. Sansa would not fight a head-on war. She would let the South tear itself apart, then present an accomplished fact. The North was independent, as no one possessed the strength to subdue it. But if Daenerys somehow seized an upper hand and toppled Cersei, Sansa could claim plausible deniability about any sabotage. She could hail the new queen, all while retaining enough leverage to negotiate autonomy. She knew it was a risky gambit, but so was any attempt to break the cycle of subservience. For centuries, the North had bent the knee to Targaryens, Baratheons, and once again Targaryens. Enough was enough. Sansa pressed her lips into a line, her resolve firm. Daenerys and Jon left the crossroads in before dawn, leading their column southwest. The muddy roads churned under the weight of wagons and cavalry, forcing a slower pace than they might have wished. Scouts rode ahead, scanning for any sign of the Golden Company. Still, the first day passed without bloodshed, though tension simmered in every tent at night. On the second day, near midday, their vanguard spied a group of Golden Company outriders perched on a low ridge. The Targaryen host quickly formed ranks, unsullied at the center, Dothraki skirting the flanks. The Golden Company outriders withdrew, leading them on a cautious chase across rolling hills. Daenerys suspected it was a deliberate tactic, a way to lure them into an unfavorable position. Jon consulted quickly with Grey Worm, Davos, and Jorah Mormont, who had rejoined them after recovering from his previous injuries. They agreed to dispatch a small force of mounted archers to harry the scouts, while the main host stayed in formation. Daenerys watched from a vantage point atop a small knoll. Drogon and Rhaegal circled overhead, ready to descend at a moment's notice. When the Targaryen archers engaged, a brief skirmish followed. Arrows sang through the air, but the Golden Company scouts proved adept riders, maneuvering to avoid being pinned. They lost a few men, but inflicted a few wounds of their own before pulling back, disappearing beyond a wooded area. Jon and Daenerys did not order a reckless pursuit. Tyrion, who had watched from the main line, exhaled once the clash ended. "A test," he muttered, riding up to Daenerys. "They're gauging our responses, our willingness to chase. Good thing we didn't fall for it." Daenerys nodded, eyes narrowing on the fading swirl of dust. "We'll proceed carefully. If they try to lure us into a forest ambush, we'll let the dragons handle them from above. We can flush them out with fire if needed." Jon listened, face grim. "So it begins," he said. "This is likely the first of many probes. They'll try to slow us until we're vulnerable." That night, the Targaryen host camped near a shallow lake, setting up sentries around the perimeter. The men ate cold rations, too wary to light large fires that might mark their position. Overhead, the sky was clear, revealing thousands of stars. Despite the celestial beauty, no one felt at ease. Jon walked through the rows of tents, checking on morale. Dothraki riders whispered of how they preferred open battle to these cautious maneuvers. Unsullied stood silent, disciplined. Northerners mumbled about the cunning of Sel's words. All the while, Jon fought a sense of foreboding that something big was coming. Daenerys, too, paced the makeshift camp, the torchlight gilding her white hair. She paused occasionally to confer with an officer or pat the flank of a restless horse. When midnight neared, a horn's low call shattered the silence. Grey Worm emerged from the darkness, reporting that a group of enemy skirmishers was approaching from the west. Within moments, the Targaryen camp was in motion, men roused from their bedrolls, swords and spears at the ready. Daenerys felt her pulse quicken as she mounted her horse, scanning the horizon for any sign of scorpion bolts or other traps. Drogon and Rhaegal roared from their roost nearby, stirring terror in any who heard them. A few dozen Golden Company men appeared at the edge of the torchlight, firing arrows into the fringes of the camp. Unsullied shields raised in disciplined lines. The clash was sudden and sharp, a mere testing strike. As soon as the Targaryen defenders began to form a counterattack, the Golden Company vanished back into the darkness. Several more men were left wounded on both sides, an echo of steel on steel in the night. Jon cursed under his breath, crouching beside a wounded northern archer who gasped for air, an arrow lodged in his side. A maester's aide rushed over, pressing cloths to the wound. In the flickering torchlight, Jon recognized the man, someone who had grown up near last hearth. He gripped his hand as the man groaned. "Stay still," Jon urged. "They'll tend to you." The archer coughed up blood, eyes rolling in panic. "Am I dying?" Jon squeezed his hand. "No, you'll live. Just hold on." But the look in the man's eyes suggested he knew better. Blood soaked the cloth, the color stark as it spread. Within minutes, the archer's breathing stopped, and he lay still, candlelit eyes staring blankly. Jon stood, fists clenched. This was only the beginning, and men were dying in these small skirmishes. Men who had fought against the dead, only to fall in a war of living ambitions. Daenerys approached, her face drawn. "More harrying tactics," she said quietly. "They want us exhausted, always on guard." He nodded, jaw tense. "Then we have to push forward more aggressively. We can't let them dictate the terms." Daenerys placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll discuss it at dawn with the commanders. For now, see if you can get some rest. We'll need clear minds if we're to outthink them." Jon glanced down at the dead archer, sorrow flickering across his features. "Rest," he murmured. "Right." The next morning, Daenerys, Jon, Tyrion, Ser Davos, Grey Worm, and Jorah convened near a large table set with maps under a wide pavilion. The air tasted of dew and tension. Daenerys stood at the head, drumming her fingers on the wooden surface as she surveyed the drawings. Tyrion rubbed his temple, looking weary from lack of sleep. "They keep striking at night," Jorah observed. "We can't keep losing men a few at a time, or we'll never reach King's Landing in decent shape." Davos frowned at the map. "They're spread out in small units, retreating into the countryside. We could attempt to chase them down, but that could leave our supply train exposed. If they slip behind us, we'll be in worse shape." Jon spoke up. "What if we split our forces into 3 columns, spaced so they can reinforce each other quickly? We cover more ground that way, preventing the Golden Company from slipping around us so easily. And if one column is attacked, the others can converge." Tyrion chewed on his lip. "A dangerous gamble. Splitting can also invite defeat in detail." Daenerys exhaled. "Yet staying bunched up makes us too slow, and the Golden Company can keep chipping at us. We do have the dragons as a roving deterrent. They can move swiftly to any column that's threatened." Grey Worm nodded. "If Drogon and Rhaegal can be overhead, the Golden Company will think twice before attacking in force." Daenerys turned to Jon. "All right, let's try it. We'll divide our ground troops. Grey Worm will command the center, you take the left flank with the northern men, and Jorah takes the right with the Dothraki. I'll remain mobile with Drogon, and Rhaegal will follow your lead. Jon, if you choose to ride him." Jon hesitated. He had not ridden Regal since before the journey south, and each time he thought of it, he remembered the cost of the war with the dead. Still, he nodded. "If it's necessary, I will." "Then it's decided," Daenerys said. "We move out within the hour. The Golden Company wants to bleed us. Let's make them pay in blood instead." With that, the council dispersed. Soldiers were roused, gear repacked, and formations adjusted. The lines of Unsullied parted into 3 distinct columns, each flanked by some Northerners or Dothraki, depending on the plan. The supply wagons were secured in the center column under heavy guard, while outriders scouted for ambushes. Yora rode at the head of the right column, outwardly stoic but inwardly concerned about Daenerys' safety. Grey Worm commanded the center with calm determination. Jon led the left, each step through the grass reminding him of how precarious the situation was. Above, Drogon's massive wings cast a shifting shadow. Daenerys perched on his back like a queen of legend. Regal followed, circling in a wide arc, but kept some distance, still watchful, waiting for Jon to climb aboard if the need arose. The troops' morale was boosted somewhat by the visible presence of the dragons, though every man knew the beasts were not invincible. They advanced for hours through farmland and rolling hills, meeting no serious resistance. At midday, the columns regrouped near a gently sloping valley. Scouts reported only minimal sightings of enemy outriders, no direct engagements. Hope crept in that perhaps the Golden Company was biding its time for a larger battle, or that they had misjudged Daenerys' route. That afternoon, the left column, under Jon's command, approached a low ridge dotted with small clusters of trees. The sun glared overhead, beating down on the men in their armor. As they crested the ridge, one of the northern outriders galloped back to Jon's position, dust swirling around his horse's hooves. "Lord Snow," the outrider panted, reining in. "We spotted a Golden Company party ahead, maybe 200 strong, near a shallow ravine. They don't seem to have scorpions with them, but they're well armed." Jon's face set into grim lines. "They must be trying to block our path. We can't divert too far without risking losing contact with the other columns. We have to clear them out." The outrider nodded. "Aye, they're forming ranks, might be expecting a fight. We saw a banner that looked like an officer's station. Could be a commander among them." Jon took a moment to consider. "We'll form a shield wall with the Unsullied in the front, Northern archers behind. We can press them slowly. I'll signal Regal if it looks like they have reinforcements. We'll not risk a full cavalry charge if the terrain is uncertain." The outrider saluted and rode off to relay orders. Jon glanced to the sky, seeing Regal's silhouette drifting near the center column's location, not far off. He tried to steady his breathing, remembering how to summon the dragon. He'd done it once in a surge of adrenaline back in the north. Now, the idea of climbing onto Regal in the midst of a pitched battle unnerved him. But if it saved lives, he would do it. The command traveled through the ranks swiftly. They would confront the Golden Company force head-on. Tension rippled among the soldiers, but they advanced in disciplined lines, unsullied spears bristling. The men walked in unison, shields overlapping. Northern archers drew arrows, scanning for their targets. Soon, they spotted the Golden Company unit, arrayed in a broad formation across the ravine. Mercenary captains barked orders, and a golden banner with the sigil of a four-headed dragon crowned with swords flapped in the hot breeze. One of the Sellsword group's oldest standards, ironically featuring a dragon as an emblem of their original founder. Their ranks were a mix of Westerosi exiles, Essosi knights, and hardened veterans who had fought in half a dozen wars. Jon urged his horse forward, positioning himself behind the first line of spears. A northern standard-bearer stood to his right, holding aloft the direwolf banner. At Jon's nod, horns sounded, and the Targaryen side advanced. The Golden Company responded by marching to meet them. The distance narrowed. The first clash was a hail of arrows from both sides. Arrows peppered the shields of the Unsullied, while the northern archers responded in kind. Men fell on both sides, cries echoing through the ravine. Jon gripped the pommel of Longclaw, waiting for the melee to begin. When the lines collided, it was the brutal sound of steel against steel, the scrape of iron on bone. The Unsullied moved with trained precision, thrusting spears between shields, pressing forward methodically. The Golden Company fought back with practiced skill, each man worth the weight of his mercenary contract. Jon spurred his horse along the flank, calling out orders. Northern swordsmen dashed in where they could find openings, only to be met by the Sellsword's disciplined ranks. Amid the chaos, Jon spotted a cluster of golden-helmed officers rallying their men. The terrain made it difficult for cavalry to break through. The ravine's uneven ground threatened to unseat riders. The Sellswords had chosen their position well. Slowly, the Targaryen line advanced, but the cost in blood was real. Screams mingled with the clash of weapons, dust swirling from the trodden earth. At one point, a mercenary with a boar crest on his shield charged at Jon, sword swinging. Jon parried, the clang jarring his bones. He twisted in his saddle, slashing downward. Long claw bit into the mercenary's shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground. Another lunged from the side, but a northern pikeman skewered him before he could reach Jon. Everywhere, the smell of sweat and blood hung in the air. By degrees, the Golden Company line showed signs of wavering. Their commander shouted for them to hold formation, but the relentless push of the Unsullied began to tell. Then, from behind the ranks, Jon heard a horn blast. At first, he thought it was a Targaryen signal, but then he saw dust rising on the far side of the ravine. A second group of Sellswords, possibly a reinforcement of equal size, emerged, ready to hammer into the Targaryen flank. Jon's heart lurched. If the second wave crashed into them now, they might be pinned in the ravine, forced into a deadly trap. He wheeled his horse around, scanning the sky. Regal soared in the distance. Jon brought 2 fingers to his lips and whistled sharply, a signal taught by Daenerys. Whether the dragon heard it or not was uncertain, but an outrider took it as a sign and loosed a flaming arrow into the sky, a further signal. In moments, Regal changed direction, banking toward the ravine. Jon saw the great green dragon arrowing in with terrifying speed. The mercenaries spotted Regal too, and a ripple of panic spread through their formation. The second wave hesitated, unsure whether to charge while a dragon approached overhead. That brief hesitation was enough for Jon to seize the advantage. "Push!" he roared. "We have them now." The Unsullied hammered forward, spears flashing. Northern swordsmen surged behind them. The Golden Company's first line crumpled under the renewed assault. Regal unleashed a torrent of emerald flame at the second wave, forcing them to scatter. Some Sellswords dove for cover in the rocky outcrops. Others simply turned to flee. Those caught in the conflagration screamed in agony, their armor glowing red-hot, flesh blistering. The air filled with smoke and ash, sparks raining down. Jon guided his horse through the chaos, hacking at any mercenary who stood in his path. The combined shock of the ground assault and the dragon's fire soon broke the Golden Company's resolve. Men threw down weapons or tried to run, only to be run down by Dothraki screamers who arrived from the right flank in a timely maneuver. Within the hour, the Sellsword force was in tatters. Bodies littered the ravine. Jon's forces had suffered heavy losses too, especially among the forward lines. But they had triumphed, staving off what could have been a devastating ambush. Regal perched on a rocky crag, growling low as if daring any survivors to rise and fight again. Jon surveyed the carnage, chest heaving. The ground was slick with blood, the sun overhead scorching the battlefield. He found an unsullied captain, who saluted sharply. "We hold the ravine, Lord Snow," the captain said in a clipped accent. "Captives have been taken. Orders." Jon glanced over at the huddled group of prisoners, maybe 24 Sellswords who had thrown down arms. He wiped sweat from his brow, swallowing his distaste at executing them outright. "Chain them. We'll question them for information about the Golden Company's deployments. Then we'll decide their fate." He stepped gingerly through the aftermath, stopping to kneel beside a fallen northern man whose tabard was soaked in blood. The soldier's face was twisted in a final grimace. Jon closed his eyes, murmuring a soft prayer to the old gods. He stood, grimacing as he saw the piles of wounded. Maesters and healers scurried from man to man, trying to save who they could. When the dust settled, Yora arrived with a small group of Dothraki, having been alerted by the horn signals. He dismounted, solemnly taking in the devastation. "7 hells," he muttered, kneeling to examine a wounded Unsullied. "We'll need to set up a field hospital quickly. Where's Daenerys?" Jon wiped his sword clean on a rag. "Likely overhead with Drogon or seeing to the center column. She was covering them from ambush. She sent Regal to me." Yora nodded. "At least we won. But this is only a fraction of the Golden Company's might. They're testing us, wearing us down before we reach King's Landing." Jon closed his eyes briefly, exhausted. "We need to press on once we gather ourselves. We can't give them time to regroup." In the distance, Regal took flight again, heading toward the main body of the Targaryen army. Jon watched him go, remembering the wild sense of flight he'd once experienced. Now, he only felt the weight of command pressing relentlessly on him. As the battlefield was cleared, Jon oversaw the questioning of a captured officer. The man was older, with gray in his beard and an accent that suggested he'd fought in the Free Cities. Bound at the wrists, he glared at Jon with defiance. "Go on, kill me," he spat. "I took the coin, I fought your men. That's how it is." Jon stepped closer. "Where is your main force? Is this the only forward unit? Or are there more?" The officer's lip curled. "You'll find out soon enough when they cut you down. But if you think I'll betray my company, you're a fool." Jon felt a stab of frustration. "I don't want to kill you. Answer my questions, and perhaps your life can be spared." The man barked a harsh laugh. "Sellswords know the cost of not standing by their contract. The Golden Company enforces loyalty. Do your worst." Jon's jaw tightened. He looked to the side, where some other prisoners cowered. "Separate this one. Interrogate the rest individually. Someone might talk if they think the others are silent." The captured officer kept his eyes on Jon. "Waste your time if you wish," he said. "We were all paid well to do one thing. Bleed you dry. You might have won this skirmish, but you'll lose the war." Jon walked away unsettled. He found himself longing for the clarity of the battle against the dead, where no negotiation was possible, only survival. This war felt filthier, pitting living men against each other in a deadly game of ambitions. In King's Landing, Cersei sat in her solar, reading the latest reports of the skirmish at the ravine. A messenger, wearing the lion sigil, had arrived with the news that a Golden Company unit had tested Daenerys' left flank but ultimately lost. Her mouth thinned in displeasure. She sipped at her wine, a muscle in her jaw twitching. She set the parchment aside, turning to Qyburn. "So they failed to deliver a decisive blow." Qyburn bowed his head. "Indeed, Your Grace, but they inflicted losses. Our scouts say the Targaryen forces were bloodied, though not broken." Cersei tapped a finger against her lip. "And the dragons? Any sign of success in targeting them?" "None, I'm afraid," Qyburn admitted. "They did not have scorpions in that engagement, only standard arms. Our best chance remains luring the dragons within range of our carefully placed batteries." Cersei's eyes flickered with cold intensity. "Then we stay the course. Bleed them as they come. Force them to expend energy. Ensure that each day brings them another wound. By the time they reach the walls of King's Landing, if they do, they'll be too weak to mount a proper siege." She glanced out the window, where she could see the Red Keep's walls gleaming in the midday sun. In the distance, the city's narrow streets teemed with people. "What of the wildfire caches?" she asked quietly, turning back to Qyburn. "Are they in place to greet them if they breach the gates?" Qyburn gave a slight nod. "Yes, my queen, though it remains a potent risk. The slightest mishandling." "Spare me the caution," she snapped. "We'll take every advantage we can. Once Daenerys Targaryen stands at our gates with her dragons, I want her to know that even if she rains fire on us, we'll burn the city from beneath her." Let her choke on the ashes of King's Landing if she dares. The small folk be damned. They're hardly loyal to me anyway. Qyburn bowed lower. As you command, your grace. Cersei's lips twisted into a mirthless smile. And what of the northern girl's letters? She gestured to a table where Sansa Stark's last raven-sent message lay. She demands a guarantee of Jon Snow's safety. Has the next reply been sent? Not yet, your grace. I wish to confirm your exact wording. Cersei considered a moment. Write that I remain committed to our arrangement for as long as she does. That Jon Snow shall face no harm if he surrenders or is captured, so long as the North stands apart from the final confrontation. Use ambiguous language, just enough to placate her. Yes, my queen, Qyburn said, moving to fetch quill and ink. Inwardly, Cersei marveled at Sansa's stubbornness. To think the girl believed she could hold the Lannister queen to a promise if the tide of war turned. Still, Sansa's desire to keep Jon Snow alive might prove useful. Sansa might sabotage Daenerys enough to ensure that, by the time the Targaryen queen reached King's Landing, she'd be fighting with half a sword. Cersei relished the thought. Back in the north, in a dim corridor near the Maester's tower, Arya found the stable boy who served as Sansa's messenger. He was leading a freshly saddled horse, preparations for a late-night journey evident. Arya moved with quiet grace, intercepting him. He nearly dropped the reins in surprise when she stepped from the shadows, her face impassive. Where are you going? Arya asked simply, her eyes fixed on the leather pouch the boy carried. He stammered, Lady Arya, I've business for Lady Stark. Arya glanced at the horse, then at the boy's anxious expression. So late at night? What sort of business? He shifted nervously, trying not to meet her gaze. I'm to deliver a message, my lady. The Lady of Winterfell gave me orders. I can't speak more. Arya noted the sealed pouch. Her instincts told her it bore something important. She felt the tension coiling in her gut. Sansa had told no one of these frequent dispatches, and that secrecy gnawed at Arya's suspicions. You can't speak more, she echoed, stepping closer. I could make you speak. He gulped, eyes darting around. I am loyal to House Stark, my lady. I do as Lady Sansa commands. Arya considered him, reading the genuine fear on his face. He was a boy, a messenger with no illusions of grandeur. She slowly nodded, stepping aside. Go then. But if I catch you lying or carrying something dangerous for Winterfell, I'll find you. He nodded frantically and hurried to mount the horse. Arya watched him ride away under the moonlight, her mind spinning. She could not simply confront Sansa without proof, but she suspected that these letters, whatever they were, played a pivotal role in the unfolding war. She lingered there, letting the night air chill her cheeks, pondering her next move. A part of her believed Sansa's decisions might endanger Jon or their entire family, but Arya also knew that they had survived countless betrayals. Trust was a commodity as rare as Valyrian steel. She resolved to watch Sansa more closely. If her sister's machinations threatened the Starks, Arya would not stand idle. In the southern fields, as dusk settled, Daenerys' 3 columns finally converged for a moment of respite. The battle at the ravine had taken its toll, and other minor skirmishes had erupted with smaller Golden Company parties. But the Targaryen host pressed steadily onward. The ground became flatter, dotted with the remains of old farms and scorched villages from previous wars. Under a large tent, Daenerys convened her war council again, trying to decide the best route to King's Landing. A battered scout reported that the Golden Company had numerous defensive lines near the Crownlands. The once fertile fields around the capital were rumored to be heavily trapped with scorpions and perhaps worse. Euron's fleet patrolled Blackwater Bay. Tyrion traced lines on the map, shaking his head. We might consider feigning a direct approach, then circling around to approach from the Rose Road. Or we can attempt a forced crossing of the Blackwater River further upstream, though that would be treacherous with Euron about. Daenerys sighed. Either way, we'll face an entrenched foe. But we cannot linger here. We must push forward while they're still uncertain of our true approach. Jon, seated across from her, rubbed his eyes. We should consult with the other column's scouts, see which path is least defended, and we need to pick a spot to attempt a crossing, or at least secure a forward base. If we approach King's Landing without a base, we risk a siege with no fallback. Yora nodded in agreement. Storm's End remains in ruins, not truly viable. Dragonstone is too far east, though it could be an option if we had more ships. But Euron's presence on the sea complicates that. Daenerys stared at the map, recalling our earlier days in Westeros when she landed at Dragonstone, then marched inland. So much had changed. She felt like half her forces had been lost to the Great War or scattered. The realm that had once hailed her as a liberator now seemed to greet her with suspicion and cunning. If only the North's reinforcements had come in greater number, she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Jon tensed, hearing her complaint. He couldn't deny that fewer Northern soldiers had come than expected, but he also resented any implication that the North had shirked its duties. They had given so much, bled so much. He kept silent, though, forcing himself to focus on the immediate tactical concern. Eventually, they decided to push toward a crossing near a small town called Harvest Hall, rumored to be lightly defended. If they secured that area, they could approach King's Landing from the western side, possibly avoiding some of the Scorpion emplacements. The meeting broke, leaving each to prepare for another day's march. Daenerys lingered a moment with Jon as Tyrion and Yora exited. The lantern light danced on the canvas walls, making shadows flicker. She reached out, touching Jon's arm softly. "Thank you," she said, "for your counsel and for being here." He met her gaze, seeing the weariness in her eyes. She was no longer the fresh conqueror who had sailed from Essos, certain of victory. She had lost much: dragons, allies, illusions. Yet beneath the fatigue, a fierce resolve still glowed. "We'll see this through," Jon said gently, "no matter what comes." She allowed herself to lean in, pressing her forehead to his briefly. It was a small gesture of closeness that reaffirmed their bond. Then, as if catching herself, she straightened. "We should rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be another test." He nodded, and they parted ways, each to their separate tents, each burdened by the knowledge that dawn would bring them closer to a final confrontation. In the Red Keep's throne room, the echo of footsteps resounded against marble floors. Torchlight glinted on the iron seat perched atop a dais. Cersei Lannister sat upon the Iron Throne, posture poised, eyes cold as she watched the men assembled before her. They were a delegation of Crownland's lords and a few merchants from the city. The tension in the air was palpable. Lord Bywater, a portly man with thinning hair, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we come humbly to express our concerns. Food stocks in the city are running low, and the people—" Cersei's scornful glance cut him off. "You think I'm unaware of the city's needs, Lord Bywater? War demands sacrifices. If Daenerys Targaryen's forces starve outside our walls, we will endure rationing until they break." One merchant, bolder than the rest, stepped forward. "But, Your Grace, the small folk suffer. They fear the dragons will come and burn them alive. Some whisper they should open the gates to avoid." Cersei's lips curled in a dangerous smile. "Open the gates?" She repeated, voice low. "To the very woman who burned Randall Tarly and his son? The woman who allied with Dothraki screamers to lay waste to the Reach? My people would fare no better under her rule." The merchant trembled, realizing his misstep. "I meant no treason, my queen, only to voice the fears of the common folk." Cersei's expression hardened. "Their fears are misplaced. The only reason Daenerys Targaryen might burn this city is if fools among you talk of opening gates. If anyone dares speak of surrender, they will meet a swift end." A hush fell. Lord Bywater dabbed at the sweat on his brow. "Of course, Your Grace. We remain loyal." She stood, letting her gaze sweep the assembly. "Leave me," she commanded. "See that you do your part to maintain order among the masses. Spread the word that any sedition will be punished, publicly and harshly. Now go." The group bowed and retreated, footsteps echoing in hurried unison. Cersei stepped down from the throne, a frown creasing her brow. She knew the small folk could become a liability if their fear boiled into riots. But she also understood how to use fear to keep them docile. As she exited the throne room, Jaime's memory flickered through her mind unbidden. She banished it with a flash of anger. She had no time for ghosts, only for victory. The city's catapults and scorpions were readied on the walls, the caches of wildfire placed for final measures. Euron's fleet guarded the bay, though it vexed her that she had to share any measure of power with that swaggering braggart. Still, he was useful, and that was enough. Cersei walked the corridors with the measured grace of a sovereign, ignoring the courtiers who flattened themselves against the walls to avoid her path. She was heading to her private quarters when she passed a window that overlooked the city. For a moment, she paused, staring at the sprawl of buildings clinging to the hillside. Wind teased tendrils of her golden hair. She felt the pulse of kings landing like a giant beast under her control. Fickle, sometimes rebellious, but ultimately hers to command. She thought again of Sansa Stark, up in the cold north, weaving her quiet machinations. Cersei wondered if Sansa truly believed that once Daenerys was beaten, the Lannisters would simply grant the North independence and let them be. The notion almost amused her enough to chuckle. She would give Sansa precisely as much freedom as served her own ends, then cast the North aside if it suited her. That was the nature of power, using alliances to climb higher before discarding them. Stepping away from the window, she continued on to her quarters, intent on reviewing the day's messages. Somewhere out there, Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow were still inching closer, their ambitions pinned on dethroning her. Let them come. She would greet them with fire and steel, ensuring that they regret challenging the last Lannister who truly understood the weight of the Iron Throne. In Winterfell, Sansa read Cersei's newest reply by the light of a single candle. The words were artfully chosen, offering vague assurances that if Jon Snow were taken prisoner, he would be spared, provided the North took no hostile action toward the crown. It was the same dance of half-truths that Sansa herself engaged in. She noted the nuances. Cersei had made no mention of Daenerys, no mention of the kingdom's ultimate shape after the war. Only that so long as Sansa withheld additional support from Daenerys, Cersei would remember their understanding. Sansa's lips pressed into a thin line. She wondered how much longer she could maintain this balancing act. War was raging, men dying. Each day, ravens brought new tales of skirmishes. How soon before Daenerys faced a decisive battle near King's Landing, and how soon before the North's tenuous neutrality became obvious enough to draw Jon's suspicion. Tucking the letter away, Sansa strolled to the small window. The sky was clear, the moon bright. She shut her eyes, recalling the hush of the godswood, the ancient face carved into the weirwood. Perhaps she should go there, pray for guidance. Yet she found herself questioning the old gods, unsure if they could grant absolution for her hidden alliance with the woman who had once nearly destroyed her family. She was about to leave her solar when a soft knock broke the silence. Startled, she opened the door to find Podrick Payne standing there, expression tense. "My lady," he said, "Ser Brienne requests your presence in the courtyard. It's urgent." Sansa's pulse quickened. "What is it?" Podrick licked his lips. "A small party from the Vale has arrived. They claim to bear news and more men, but they seem agitated." Without another word, Sansa followed Podrick through Winterfell's dimly lit corridors, down the stone steps, and into the courtyard. There, Brienne stood with arms folded, eyeing a group of heavily cloaked men dismounting from their horses. Their leader, a grizzled knight with the falcon sigil of House Arryn, bowed stiffly when Sansa approached. "My Lady Stark," he said, breath misting in the cold air. "I come from Lord Royce, bearing a message." He handed over a sealed letter. "We've also brought 100 men from the Vale, at your disposal." Sansa tore open the seal, scanning the contents. Lord Royce wrote in a strong, clear hand, "The Vale stands ready to protect House Stark. I send these men to fortify Winterfell as you requested. However, rumors claim you are withholding full support from the Targaryen cause. I counsel caution. If the war goes poorly for Daenerys, Sansa Stark may find herself accused of treachery. She swallowed, folding the letter carefully. "And how fares the Vale?" she asked, voice steady. The knight exhaled. "Some lords grumble that they should join the Targaryen cause more openly. Others fear Cersei. We remain loyal to the Starks first and foremost. Lord Royce sends these men so that you have the means to keep Winterfell secure. But he also urges you not to let rumor overshadow your loyalty to your brother." Sansa thanked him, then turned to Brienne. "Find quarters for them," she instructed. "Ensure they have a place in our defenses." The tall knight bowed. "Yes, my lady." As Brienne guided the new arrivals away, Sansa glanced at Podrick, who lingered near the stable. She could see the questions in his eyes, questions she did not care to answer tonight. Instead, she walked slowly back into the keep, the letter from Royce folded in her hands like a leaden weight. Even her allies cautioned her now. The walls were closing in. She reached the foot of the stairway that led back to her solar and paused. Instead of ascending, she turned abruptly toward the corridor that led to the Godswood. She walked with measured steps, ignoring the chill that seeped through the stone. If she could not find clarity with her counselors, perhaps she might find it under the ancient weirwood's gaze. When she arrived in the Godswood, she found it empty save for the whispering branches and the quiet pool. Snow dusted the ground, forming a pale hush around the towering heart tree. Sansa approached, pressing a gloved hand to the carved face. The wood felt cold and unyielding. She inhaled the crisp air, letting her thoughts swirl. She remembered her father's devotion to these old gods, how he would come here in the early mornings. She felt a pang of nostalgia, but also a surge of resolution. Everything she did for the North's freedom, to spare future generations the subjugation her father had endured. Even if that meant forging a pact with Cersei Lannister, someone who had once reveled in Ned Stark's downfall. For a moment, she closed her eyes, imagining the old gods staring back at her through the face in the bark. Would they judge her for playing this game? Or would they see the justice in seeking independence? She recalled their silence in so many tragedies. Perhaps the old gods demanded that mortals shape their own fates. Quietly, she knelt on the snow, letting the hush envelop her. The wind rattled the branches. Time seemed to stretch. She could almost hear faint whispers in the rustle, as though the tree itself remembered the tragedies of House Stark. Yet it gave no direct answer, offered no absolution. Sansa exhaled, rising after a moment, and turned away. As she left the Godswood, she steeled herself for the next step. Whether the Vale, the North, or even Arya questioned her, she would not waver. The final confrontation drew nearer with each passing day, and Sansa intended to see the North on the winning side, her side. If Daenerys fell, so be it. If Cersei eventually betrayed her, Sansa would be ready with her own blade concealed. That was the nature of the world she inhabited. She was no longer a lamb waiting for rescue. She was a wolf, and wolves survived by their wits and their teeth. At last, Daenerys' vanguard approached the outskirts of the Crownlands, a patchwork of farmland once fertile, now marred by war's scars. The nights grew warmer, the wind carrying the faint tang of salt from the Blackwater rush. Tension mounted as the Targaryen columns reunited, bracing for a final push toward King's Landing. Each day, the Golden Company tested them with raids or standoffs, but no large-scale battle materialized yet. Cersei, it seemed, was content to let them come to her walls. The mood in the camp was grim. After weeks of marching and skirmishes, the men were fatigued. Supplies ran thin, as the roads had become dangerous. Jon noticed more and more wounded in the healers' tents, and fewer men to fight. Daenerys, perched on Drogon at times, surveyed the endless sprawl of enemy territory with a growing unease. Even the Dothraki, who thrived on the thrill of combat, looked subdued by the strain of so many small, inconclusive clashes. It was twilight when a scout raced into camp, breathless and bleeding from a gash on his cheek. He slid from his horse in front of Tyrion and Jon, who happened to be inspecting the perimeter. "My lords," he gasped. "The Golden Company is forming a defensive line near the Rose Road, Thousands, maybe more, with scorpions mounted. They're waiting for us. Jon's stomach nodded. How far? Less than a day's ride south. They seem to be anchoring their line at a ruined holdfast, using the hills for cover. They have at least a dozen scorpions, maybe more. Didn't dare get too close. Tyrion's expression darkened. So that's the next battlefield. They'll want to stop us before we can even see the walls of King's Landing. If we charge in blindly, we risk the dragons. Jon nodded grimly. We need a plan that neutralizes those scorpions. Perhaps we can flank them or draw them out. We can't let them pick Drogon and wriggle off mid-flight. The scout gulped. They have pickets all along the ridges. Hard to approach unseen. Tyrion sighed, looking every bit as though his shoulders bore the weight of the entire war. We'll need to gather Daenerys and the others. This could be the decisive engagement before King's Landing. If we fail, we'll never breach the capital. Jon clapped the scout on the shoulder. Get that wound looked at. You did well. As the scout limped away, Jon realized that the moment they had been dreading was finally at hand. One way or another, the next battle might shape the fate of the realm. King's Landing lay just beyond, and with it, the labyrinth of political consequences. He tried to steady his thoughts. Whether or not the North had withheld some of its strength, this was the host he had. These were the men who would fight beside him with dragons overhead. And on the other side would be scorpions, cunning sellswords, and the cold will of Cersei Lannister. Jon wondered where Sansa fit in all this. He prayed she was safe in Winterfell, maintaining order, doing what was best for their home. Little did he know how her secret letters were shaping the battlefield he now faced, and how, even if he survived the clash with the Golden Company, the final confrontation in King's Landing would demand a reckoning for every quiet betrayal. Night settled over the camp, and torchlight glimmered across drawn faces and battered armor. The hush felt like a coiled serpent, ready to strike. Tomorrow or the next day, they would face the might of the Golden Company head-on. Jon gazed at Rhaegal's silhouette against the stars, wondering if this final push would see the realm broken entirely, or reborn under the banner of the dragon. In the distance, the city's lights were just visible, faint pinpricks on the horizon. King's Landing, the seat of power, the heart of so many tragedies. The Targaryen queen and her northern king in all but name pressed ever closer, each step resonating with the memory of so much blood spilled. And in that city, an iron-willed Lannister queen waited, her traps laid, her cunning honed by years of cruelty. Between them, a young wolf in Winterfell quietly pulled strings, seeking to secure a future that served her own notion of freedom. All of Westeros held its breath, poised on the cusp of a new turning. And none could say whose banner would fly when the fires cooled and the bones were finally counted.